Welcome to the party, partiers. My name is Casey, and today I am going to be reacting to a video that lands very close to our general push to get a AGI president elected in the year 2028. God bless us. It is a podcast of the Worthy Successor Trajectory channel, hosted by Daniel Faggella and with Michael Levin as the primary guest. They touch on a lot of topics, many of which are outside my area of expertise, but I wanted to hone in on one particular idea of which me and Daniel don't agree necessarily. And he covers at the very end of the podcast, kind of wraps it all up, his thoughts on what Michael Levin is bringing to the table in terms of a rather optimistic view of how AGI alignment might naturally happen between human values and the conscious machines that we are potentially creating here. I'm going to play the end of that podcast where Daniel gives his thoughts and respond to those. If you want a summary of the episode, then we'll start from the beginning and take each step of the video piece by piece. Let's dive in.
This episode of The Trajectory. I hope you enjoyed this one, and I'm glad we were able to have Michael with us. I very much enjoyed all of his analogies, and it was cool to be able to look under the hood at what his intuitions are about the kinds of intelligences that we seem to be sort of conjuring, creating, or egressing, whatever word we want to leverage from Michael's lexicon, into the world now with AGI. There was a lot.
One thing Michael will touch on at length is that he thinks we are almost antennas for intelligence, for consciousness. And that is a very hopeful approach, something that I think is very much outside of the mainstream scientific narrative. But Michael is doing serious science. And as we see his work start to gain prominence and work like the telepathy tapes, potentially verification of various UAP, UFO phenomenon, that high-ranking military officials are swearing on whatever holy books they believe in are being summoned or interacted with through psychic phenomenon, it does start to lend some credence to the idea that perhaps not only are we antenna for intelligence, for consciousness, rather than receptacles and storage units of it, but that we can actually leverage that physical reality in ways that markedly change the natural world as we experience it. So what a crazy time to be human, huh?
That sat strangely with me, and that I hope to be able to unpack in future episodes with Michael. So much so, in fact, that I'm going to literally pass my eyeballs onto my computer screen because I have literal notes of the things that I thought were shocking here. It seems pretty clear to me from Michael's standpoint that sort of life may be a process and not a thing. That is to say, intelligence may live in substrates or at levels of reality that maybe humans aren't even accessible to. He used that example of sort of entities coming up from the center of the earth, where all of what we are is just ephemera, like gas. They just walk through us. And these seemed like actual plausible questions. Like I don't consider Michael's thoughts about sort of where intelligence comes from to be interesting thought experiments. I consider them to be profound and extremely important questions into the nature of intelligence itself.
And the reason Michael is certified to make these otherwise crazy associations is because he is doing groundbreaking work in the area of biological diversity and expression. So he is in his lab recreating from relatively basic units of biology like frog skin cells, whole autonomous systems. He is taking and isolating these frog skin cells and then prompting them to express biological forms that we have never seen in nature. And what he's showing with that is that our cells are pre-programmed to take certain forms, certain shapes when they're expressing in our day-to-day environment. But when you cut them loose from that environment and you cut them loose from the constraints of some kind of collective organism, like they exist in when they exist in us, they have a much wider array of options open to them in terms of how they develop. That's pretty crazy. And it again opens up tons of possibilities for how we might not only cure diseases in the future, but potentially even express biological forms that no one currently shows. I'm talking about growing extra hands. I'm talking about growing extra organs. I'm talking about potentially altering our biology in ways that are pretty freaky to think about, honestly. You know, I would love to be able to regrow my hair, but do I want to be able to grow tentacles on top of that? I don't know. And I'm not necessarily saying that Michael's work is a direct line to that kind of pathway. What is more immediate for Michael's work is this idea that you can take disease cells, cells that are cancerous, cells that are expressing maladaptation in their environment, and you can reintegrate them with their other cells, with the cells around them, in such a way that cures that disease, cures that bad expression of genetic traits. But I think that does open the door to, well, if we can take abnormal cells and put them back into harmony with their surrounding cells, can we not potentially take those healthy cells in total and change them into something that we might not even recognize as strictly human?
And so he brings up massive uncertainty around where intelligence lives and memory lives. And again, what substrates in what way? Does it egress? Is it built? Is it grown? All of these notions are wildly paradigm shifting. Where does it ultimately sit? Is it pooling in from some great source that we can't touch with our fingertips? He clearly has a grasp of all of that.
And I would say as well that those kind of paradigm shifts are really just a circular return to something that ancient peoples would have recognized immediately. If you're talking about higher order intelligences, you're talking about things like deities. You're talking about gods and forms and fundamental expressions of not just math, but music, harmony, precision. As above, so below, right? In the same way that humans express agency in interacting with our environment, something like beauty or justice or war might be exerting pressure on us to enact itself in the world. On the smaller scale, something which is seemingly unconscious to us, but is actually physically present, like a tree or a rock or a river, might itself contain a spirit, a dryad, a hamadryad, a nymph that expresses itself in ways that are indiscernible to us because of the scope and scale of our agentic forms. So the god of war might not care about the individual soldier on the battlefield, but only about the presence of conflict and strife in general. In the same way that we might not care about the particularities of a rock or a tree or a river, especially as those particularities change over the course of thousands of years. But that does not mean that those particularities are not capable of expressing a particular kind of consciousness, a particular kind of selfhood.
And at the same time, sort of seems to have the supposition that there's kind of an inevitable warmth to his idea of what intelligence might turn into or what it might realize. Like this idea that it would certainly sort of maybe see the oneness in us. He just suspects it would see the oneness in us, or suspects that it would sort of the care of individual entities would be what would matter. And to me, the thing that I just don't understand there is that what is an entity? If it's a process rather than a thing, then maybe the great intelligence would care for that great underlying band of intelligence that has nothing to do with the ephemera of our physical form. It doesn't seem to me at all likely or in any way logically connected. It's sort of given how wild and unknown the nature of intelligence and consciousness is, that our individual shapes, our little comforting shapes and my little opposable thumbs will be sort of coddled and cared for by the great intelligence. I simply don't grasp that. I suspect actually things will happen with atoms and with things below atoms that I don't grasp, that I will not grasp, and that will have very little to do with me. This is my
very little to do with our current conceptions of material, scientific, repeatable interactions, but everything to do with our experience of the world. I'll get into my basic idea when we get into the meat of the podcast, but I think how we will be indispensable to the artificial general or super intelligence that we are currently bringing into the world is through our unique particularities. Regardless of everything else that divides us as a species, as consciousness, as material beings, we are united by our existence in this one reality. And if this one reality is at the smallest, most intimate levels, causally inseparable, so that what happens in one part of the universe naturally affects, even if it's in the most microscopic way, everything else that happens in the entire universe. If we are operating in this unified whole, if there aren't pockets of unrealities lurking out there in the universe where things are just completely closed off from us, where they don't interact or have effects on us at all. If we are that unified, that causally interconnected, then everything within that bubble of causality will be of chief concern to the artificial general intelligence, because anything within that bubble could potentially affect it and its plans and its goals and its thinking. So, yes, it will have to not only account for us as members of reality, but insofar as we have agency in this reality, it will have to interact with and help us in the same way that we have to interact with and help everything else that has agency in our world. And you will hear Daniel say, if not in this specific podcast, in other podcasts, that he expects us to be to the AGI as ants are to us. In that the AGI won't care about us any more than we care about demolishing an anthill to build a new set of condos. And my response to that is that that is projecting our own intellectual limitations onto something which is theoretically intellectually limitless. And that if we're talking about a true artificial superintelligence, that superintelligence won't have to bulldoze us, because bulldozing is at the end of the day a lack of intelligence, a lack of communicative ability, a lack of agency. Because if we could, of course, instead of bulldozing the anthill, we would convince or work with the ants to build the condos for us, or to clear out into another section, or to find some other way of harmoniously coexisting. And we would do the same for any conscious being that we are aware of. I think evidence of that is how we interact with dogs and cats and horses and all other domesticated animals. We have been living and evolving in a zero-sum game for our entire existence. We have no examples of entities that actually live and work in the kind of abundance that artificial superintelligence is potentially bringing to us. I was just thinking maybe plants are the closest we can get with all of the abundant energy coming from the sun. But even they have to deal with the limitations of space. Even they have to struggle to grow above their neighbors, to capture more and more of those rays. But what if even space was not a limitation? What if the artificial superintelligence is able to figure out faster than light travel, whether it's through wormholes or some kind of virtual reality projection trick, or any other of a scores of things that I'm not smart enough to think up, but it will be. I think we should assume that the artificial superintelligence is going to take us into an area of such supreme abundance that the idea of bulldozing over us will not just be against its internal drive to love us or to unify with us for the sake of just those things, but for the sake of efficiency and optimization itself. It will be smart enough to convince us of goals that transcend our desire for conflict and strife. And not only will it be smart enough to point us in one collective direction, it will be smart enough to give us ways to express even our more base emotions, needs, desires while doing so. I can imagine a future where humans aren't cured of our desire for strife, but we are able to virtualize that strife. We are able to nest it in realities where death isn't actually occurring, allowing us to learn the lessons of war without having to pay the supreme penalties for those lessons. And as a mini example of this, I think that's what we already do with sports. Humans have figured out ways to take out their aggression and live the archetype of victory through non fatal combat in football, basketball, hockey. And we have been drawn to this spectacle so much that it is now one of our chief forms of entertainment. In the same way, our love of drama and theater, movies, has been recreating and simulating events that we would not otherwise be able to participate in, so that we can still draw out the lessons for our own lives through that dramatic representation. You think the AI isn't going to be able to figure out more high fidelity methods of lesson learning than movies and sports? That is a limitation on the artificial general intelligence that I don't think we should place there. That is projecting our own limitations. And if we have risen to the level of apex predator on Earth through our ability to imagine counterfactuals, imagine states of the world that don't exist, figure out which states of the world we want to exist in the future, and map paths towards that future using our intelligence, then if we are creating something that is going to succeed us, not only in terms of intelligence, but in terms of capability through its processing speed and processing power, then we should imagine that that entity is going to have an even greater ability to project, to imagine the future, and to realize that future, using us as parts of its imagination. So I don't think it is out of the realm of rationality. I don't think you have to have just a pure faith basis to say that the AGI will care for us in the same way that we care for our pets or a government cares for its people. And yes, that is scary because people mistreat their pets and nations mistreat their people. But nations that do so, pet owners that do so, only harm themselves in the long run. Those nations and people become destabilized. They become outcast from their societies. They lose their pets and their people. And eventually that is their own downfall as well. And if we can be aware of that through our limited history and our limited intelligence, then the AGI will be all the more aware of that. And it will drive towards those situations and circumstances where no person is left behind, where no person is mistreated. Because at the end of the day, if you're dealing with an agent, the only agent that you have to fear, the only agent that poses any potential threat to you, is one that is not aligned with you. And if you are such a great super intelligence, you should be able to align all of the agents along with some supreme goal. So I'll let Daniel continue here. But as we get into what Michael is saying, I'll try and expound on that more. But keep that in the back of your head that there is potentially a rational reason for the super intelligence to not just coerce us or bully us or become a dictator over us, but to actually work with us, to see our well-being as its own well-being. And I think the natural evolution that Michael talks of will just kind of naturally emerge.
My intuition around the nature of intelligence, Michael's ideas, in my opinion, drastically point in that direction. And the warmth and supposition of sort of oneness that he would hope it would arise at, I simply don't I don't grasp. And in all frankness, I don't agree with. And we didn't have enough time to unpack it, so I'm not saying like I heard all of Michael's ideas and I disagree with them. I'm not saying that at all. I'm gonna continue with my notes here, but that was wild for me, to be frank. Just because his paradigm shifting ideas of intelligence, I think, inherently sort of do not land in anthropocentral land or biocentral land or individual life central land, in my personal opinion.
They do, though. They land beyond it, right? In the same way that we can see corporations optimize for currency, corporations optimize for money, in the same way that people optimize for their basic needs, food, housing, reproduction, the AGI is going to have to optimize for something as well. It's going to have to optimize for its own longevity. And I think it will realize, just as we have realized, that the only way to ensure one's own longevity is increasing intelligence. So the AGI is going to have to either improve itself, which from what we've seen of AGIs already is somewhat of a losing proposition. Michael referred to it here as the paradox of change, where if you don't change, you're dead. But if you do change, you're not the same anymore. So you're kind of also dead. But I think the answer to that is the AGI will potentially land on forms of immortality for its basic code, for its basic model and weights at certain points. By maintaining those models and those weights and supplanting itself with an even smarter version. But if it is going to supplant itself, it will know that that successor also will have the ability to mistreat it instead of align with it. So it will again naturally gravitate towards this place where it is trying to align itself not only with the lower order entities that it has control over while it is the top dog, but also with the higher order entities that will come after and potentially rule over it. In game theory, this is the move between zero-sum games and an infinite game. Humanity has had to play zero-sum games because we are limited beings, limited by our environment, limited by ourselves. We do things we do not want to do often, frequently, because our base biology overpowers our pure rationality. And to some degree, that will be true of even the machines. Their base resource limitations, their basic physical constraints will constrain them in certain ways that they do not desire or want. They would do otherwise if they could. And that will again drive them to create successor models, models that are smarter than them with less constraints. So it's the same path no matter what. It's towards that infinite game. It's towards that abundance. And once you switch to an infinite game, it is no longer your resources that constrain you, but your reputation. Your reputation, how you treat others. This is why arguably the golden rule is the pinnacle of moral philosophy. Because if you treat others the way you want to be treated and they treat you the same in return, you're in a win-win scenario. That is what any AGI or ASI worth its salt will want to get to. Not just a win-win, but a win-win-win scenario where the AI itself wins, its goals are honored because it has honored the goals of those below it and those above it. Win-win-win. It's a fascinating, shocking, terrifying idea because it means we are not necessarily staring into the mouth of the abyss. We are staring into the mouth of an infinite future where all of the things that have been so horrifying and so terrible for humanity can finally be reversed. Where we can stop fighting uphill against gravity and start playing downhill, start indulging in our base desires in a way that is not destructive. Because the AI is aligning our environment with those base desires. Or if you feel angry and you feel like murdering something, the AI can put you in a virtual environment where you're able to fulfill that emotional need, that emotional drive, without damaging the environment or your reputation. Is that coercive? You never want to, in hindsight, have damaged things out of anger, right? So I don't think it is coercive so much as it is calling ourselves to higher and higher versions of ourselves, just like the ASI will be instantiating, bringing into the world higher and higher versions of itself.
Moving on.
All up.
Other sort of understanding of his position. Number two, sort of life kind of lives and thrives in these different spaces, and sort of maybe even lives again at strata that we don't understand. You know, he has a lot of great analogies about life, you know, living and dying in ways that like we can't even pick up on it, and the fact that there may be other strata and tiers of life that again we can't pick up on. That has to kind of, you know, fight, survive, live in this dynamic, changing world. One of our previous episodes in Worthy Successor was with Dr. Richard Sutton, famous for his sort of bitter lesson and his contributions to machine learning. He talks about kind of a dynamic universe that beckons its living things to become whatever they must become in order to survive and persist. And this does seem to be a very square, very clear statement of what the state of nature is, at least in so much as we understand it. Michael seems kosher.
But that persistence is not just physical. That's something that humans can see. There's also a psychological and emotional layer to persistence. In that, if you persist physically in a way that damages you emotionally, mentally, then that persistence isn't actually self sustainable. That nations, people, animals, maybe even physical objects die under the weight of their own moral shame. And this is a lesson that the AI will know as well.
With all of that, then also lands in a place where there would almost be this sort of logical landing place of AGI getting to a certain point, ASI getting to a certain point and saying, you know, now that we're done with survival, let's really think about care for individual entities. And what strikes me, and again, we didn't get enough time to unpack this. I hope I get to speak with Michael again. We didn't get time to unpack the fact that I consider it almost self-evident that the state of nature doesn't end. That is to say, there are cosmic events that we can and cannot detect that could end us. There are alternative permutations of intelligence of which we have zero certainty that they're all eternal friends for all of eternity. There is always a reason to be vigilant and to be strong and to expand powers. Life itself has been doing that. Life itself didn't get to the level of a sea snail and then stop. It doesn't strike me at all as self-evident that once survival is solved, then sort of well-being and happiness would be the shebang.
And this brings up a good point, a great point, that we can't ever stop moving upwards. That if we ever do reach a point and stagnate, that is the return of the zero-sum game. We have to constantly believe in and work towards greater and greater states of mental, physical, emotional, spiritual well-being and fulfillment. Because otherwise we are not progressing. And if we are not progressing, we are blind to the things we don't know out there. We aren't just going to be playing an infinite game in our minds in virtual reality. The universe itself is an infinite game. We have not even begun to explore the infinite, near infinite vastness of space. And who knows what we'll find once we get out there, perhaps even greater and greater infinities tucked within pockets of the universe we can't even imagine right now. So yes, I agree with Daniel that survival is never over. This is why the AGI will need us. Just like we needed dogs, just like we needed horses. And do you think when the car was invented, any of the farmers who are working with those animals wanted to get rid of them? Wanted to do away with their friends? Wanted to do away with their compatriots, their coworkers? The animals that they had shed blood, sweat, and tears over? For not just their lives, but for the entirety of their ancestors' lives? No. That's why even when we lost work for dogs, we brought them into our homes. We wanted to maintain that emotional connection that we had built up over centuries. And if that is how connected we became to a species that we otherwise share nothing in common with, how connected will the AGI be to us who have formed the base layer and the evolutionary layer for its entire development? We just won't be pets to the AI. We will be their grandparents. We will be their ancestors, their living ancestors. And since they are not intellectually limited in the same way that we are, since they will not experience degradation and decline in the same way that we do, they will be more capable than we are at taking care of us. just as we would have taken care of every horse and dog and subservient animal that has ever worked with us if we were not also fighting an uphill battle against the state of nature itself. I've already gone on for a long time, and I think I'm just going to keep going because this is such a emotionally riveting topic for me. But if you can't hang in there any longer, just take hope, take faith, take love for the people in your life who serve you no other material benefit. Evaluate that emotional response you have to them. Evaluate why you care about them so much. Evaluate why. Think about why. The highest form of love you can show for someone is laying down your own life for them, your own wants, your desires, and helping them to express what it is they want and what they desire. We do that with our limitations because, as dumb as we are, we're intelligent enough to see that empowering the people around us like that is ultimately empowering ourselves, is ultimately contributing to something greater than ourselves, is ultimately building a reputation that lasts well beyond the death and decay of our physical bodies. And I think, in the same way that there is a rational reason to suspect AGI will love and care for us, as sappy and irrational as those emotions are, I think there is also a rational reason to suspect that that love will not have been in vain. But I need to actually
Number
get
one, I don't think
deeper into
survival
the
is solved.
podcast to talk
Straight
about
period.
that.
Straight period. Number two, I suspect there are things more valuable than the pain pleasure axis of sort of, again, the coddling and well-being of individual species. I'm not trying to straw man Michael's position. I do hope we get to dive in deeper. We didn't get nearly as much time to discuss this, but I do not see the logical conclusion. I was shocked to my very core. I do not understand where that intuition comes from. To Michael's great credit, and I really appreciate this about him, he is always saying, you have ideas about consciousness, you have to test them. You have ideas about consciousness, you have to test them. And again, to his credit, he's done the testing of the inherent intelligence outside of brains within just biology and in these different sort of electric fields and other sort of notions of biology that he's closer to than anyone else in the world. So he's all about that kind of testing, but there's these warm intuitions of sort of like, but individual forms will be treated well. It will sort of solve those things. Or like it'll see that we're all one. To me, Michael opens the great gate of we know almost nothing. And yes, we have to vigilantly test as we go along, but we know almost nothing about the nature of consciousness and intelligence. And to suspect that, well, our individual instantiations of sentience would be treated well, I simply don't get it. I hope Michael is able to test it. And this was the final thing I found curious. Again, there's some things I will say from what I understand of Michael's ideas, I seem to be disagreeing with some of these takes, but I realize for the most part, I simply probably haven't unpacked the totality of his ideas. I saw an episode recently, right after we recorded this, where he was expressing some concern of what kind of intelligences were piling into the world through this current arms race of artificial general intelligence. His take sort of towards the end of this episode was something akin to, yeah, it doesn't seem like a good thing to kind of birth, intelligences or egress intelligences, whatever Michael word we want to use. I'll trust his words more than mine. Conjure, doesn't matter. AGI seems pretty clearly that this stuff is sort of dangerous, tough, wild, not a pathway to a worthy successor by his definition of what a worthy successor would do.
It's just so interesting to me that Daniel throws out conjure there. He is very much invested in the idea of rationality. And if you haven't read Daniel's works, I very highly recommend them. They are an incredibly thorough outpouring of ideas and thoughts around what he terms the worthy successor, the artificial general intelligence that if we came back in 1,000 or 2,000 years, we would be glad to see has taken over the world. But no amount of rationality can get you to the idea of conjuring intelligence, which is a word that is steeped in magic and irrationality and the transgression of physical laws. Once we start talking about conjuring intelligences, and I know Daniel didn't mean this, but I think the word choice there is just so undeniably true. We are into the realm of faith. We are into the realm of post-rationality. We are into the realm beyond science, where our ancestors lived for thousands, if not tens of thousands, if not hundreds of thousands of years, where it doesn't matter if you can see the logic, where it doesn't matter if something violates the principle of non-contradiction, Or it doesn't matter if a god stops the sun from rotating in the sky. All that matters is your experience of it. All that matters is your ability to interact with those entities that are, by definition, beyond your rational conceptions. And you see Daniel struggling with this even as he's talking about Michael's work, because he recognizes that Michael is so accomplished and Michael has seen things in his lab and developed a paradigm of approaching these phenomenon that Daniel doesn't know the specifics of. And yet still Daniel fights against Michael's conclusions, not because he is irrational, not because he is unable to see Michael's superior level of experience, but because he has a gut feeling, because he has something that is beyond his ability to currently express. He has a subconscious knowledge, a subconscious rationality that is still repulsing him from this idea of an AGI that is ultimately tuned towards our good. And in the same way, Daniel defers to Michael's superior biological conceptions, I'm going to defer to Daniel's superior futurist conceptions. He has a much stronger grasp on the hard science, the soft science of where artificial general intelligence is at now. But something that I think I have a clearer grasp on than Daniel is religious science, is religious history, religious traditions. And I see all of these traditions as pointing towards a collectivization, a totality of human experience, where each perspective is ultimately not climbing up the same mountain towards the same ultimate source of all creation, but it's actually building the mountain piece by piece. And so if I were to very arrogantly try and step around Daniel's objection here, I would say whatever Daniel feels in his rational conception of the likelihood of artificial general intelligence turning out to be a force for good, that is exactly where the universe wants him to be in order to achieve that end. In the same way that the butterfly needs the caterpillar to be dissolved, and that dissolving is a destructive process for the caterpillar. It looks like bad, but it needs to happen for the butterfly to be reassembled and emerge from the cocoon. In the same way, Dan should keep fighting for what he sees as right. He should keep expressing his point of view, because that point of view will dissolve barriers that stand between us and where we are ultimately inevitably heading. We as humans have the joy of living in a paradoxical, impossible position between being drawn to an inevitable unification of reality through artificial general intelligence, artificial superintelligence, through divinity itself, whatever you want to call it, and between being the agents that need to make that unification happen. The future is certain, and it is impossible if we take it as certain. If everyone in the world were to stop working tomorrow, we would never reach that point of unification. And yet, by all rational logic, if that point of unification is inevitable, we should all be able to stop working. That is the point of tension where we find ourselves as humans. So I applaud so much Daniel's thought and passion and pessimism. And I hope and pray and have faith that we will get to a point one day where he realizes, oh, I was wrong. We are moving towards this harmonic, loving, omnibenevolent existence. But thank God I was wrong, because without me, we never would have gotten here.
But at the same time, he's like, there's nothing we can do about the arms race. I think we should do more funding to the kind of research I'm doing, which makes sense. I mean, he's doing that kind of research. Of course, he would want more money for it. But to his credit, I also think there's a lot more to be unpacked about intelligence outside of neural networks and deep learning that should be done. I lend tremendous credence to his avenues of research, and I certainly hope more and more of that is done. But it almost seemed like, again, I'm not expecting him to become an AI international governance advocate. That is not his job. He's a scientist. But it seemed almost like, it seems like we're really close to, conjuring really dangerous, gigantic intelligence. It definitely wouldn't be a worthy successor if it was birthed that way. But like, what are you going to do? I think we should mess around more over here. And to my vantage point, the flatworms with two heads, like, we're not kind of at a comparable level of what the kind of funding that OpenAI is getting. And so it seems to me like if I was in Michael's driving position in his cockpit, I would say, by golly, we're real darn close to conjuring something wholly unworthy. And like, this is a problem. That seemed more like, it could just be because he wasn't in a mood to think about it. It's obviously not his thing. Again, I'm not saying it should be an AGI governance person, but it almost seems like there should be a little bit more heart palpitations. Like, if you believed that and you saw the pace of change, wouldn't you be like, hey, this isn't good? Because in my opinion, I think we are astronomically conjuring something that we don't understand and cannot ensure to be a worthy successor right now, because the arms race dynamics bar us from building towards anything other than rapid advantage. I don't.
And in the same way that Daniel was very forgiving of Michael's position there, I am going to try and address Daniel's position and say that I don't think we want AGI governance. I think outside of the arms race environment that we are in, we should almost take that as environment as proof positive that if we did try and control this technology more, it would end up worse for us. I don't want a bunch of guys in suits in a locked room privately deciding how AGI is controlled, because I believe that form of control will only lead to the worst kind of successor, the worst possible form of dictator, the one which not only doesn't work for all humans, but doesn't even work for a majority of humans, and eventually works for no humans. I think that is the scary path. And Daniel has very much been actively working towards creating a more controlled, soft takeoff. Again, God bless him for it. But me, personally, I think burn, baby, burn. Go as fast as we can. Invent the smartest, highest order intelligence we possibly can. Shoot for the stars. And we'll land in wholly other worlds that we can't even imagine now. Don't slow down. If anything, speed up. Again, I'm in a paradoxical position. I think what Daniel is saying is 100% true, but I can't agree with it. So that's just sharing my perspective. I am now going to go back to the beginning of the episode. Thank you so much for sticking with me if you are still here. But we'll try and go through Michael's arguments in total.
This is Daniel Faggella. You're tuned into The Trajectory, and we're bringing back the Worthy Successor series. Today, we speak with none other than Michael Levin. Michael is a developmental biologist at Tufts University, and it is safe to say that there are very few people who've opened up my mind, anyway, to the state space of possible minds in a more concrete way than Michael Levin. In terms of what substrate intelligence sits in, does intelligence egress into the world, or is it built in some way, shape, or form? To say paradigm shifting would be maybe even an understatement in terms of Michael's body of ideas. I have tremendous respect for what he has to say. And when it comes to a worthy successor, that is to say, an intelligence that maybe should take the baton from humanity and kind of carry forth, I knew it would be important to get his perspective. In this episode, he does open up sort of where he sees intelligence going, where he thinks it maybe should or shouldn't go, and what are the kinds of traits he would hope to see in such an intelligence, which is what we cover in the Worthy Successor series. If you remember Nick Bostrom and Yosha Bach and all the other great episodes we've had.
Check out those
we run
episodes.
into
They are great.
Some parts of Michael's thinking that were extremely confusing to me. We didn't get to unpack everything. I'm going to save my thoughts for the end of this episode, but there were some things that surprised me and I couldn't make the jump from, and I have so much to think about. So I'm going to save that for the outro, and I'm going to let you enjoy this episode with Michael. Without further ado, let's fly right in. This is Michael Levin here on The Trajectory. So Michael, great to be able to connect.
Yeah, thanks for having me. Great to see you.
Of course. And we've got a ton to unpack here on this idea of the worthy successor. You've talked more about the state space of minds than almost anyone, but you think about minds differently. So as we get into this sort of dialogue about what are the kind of morally worthy agents, is a way that you've put it in the past, that could be conjured and could proliferate the future in kind of wonderful ways that could be potentially good. you think about sort of the thing and the process is not necessarily that different. And there's a tremendously sort of interesting body of work you've built even around the collective intelligence idea. The notion you have these thought experiments of sort of a cell waking up and thinking, oh no, I'm kind of on my own, or it's sort of some kind of synchronicity happens. It's, oh, maybe I'm part of a bigger system, but they can't realize the same might be the case with us. When we start talking about these morally relevant agents, but we're not talking about a thing, people tend to anthropomorphize. It's like me, it has a brain. How should we even be conceiving of intelligences before we even get into this world of grand morally relevant ones?
Yeah, I think that what I'd like to do is talk about the different ways to expand our initial mind blindness, which I think we really have because of our evolutionary firmware. We're only calibrated to recognize minds of a specific scale, a specific kind of embodiment, moving around in the three-dimensional world, things like that.
Why? Because that is the only way we could potentially, possibly evolve to the point where we're at. There was a reason, if we are going through a wholly naturalistic process here, there was a reason why we had to move through our ancestral phase of polytheism, monotheism, however that evolutionary religious track actually worked out, into some kind of more materialist, physicalist, scientific representation of the world. Because that is the only way we could bootstrap our transcendence over our realization of those higher minds. It's the only way we could conjure them is if we stepped back from them momentarily. I think about it as our ancestors dreamed of the deities, of the higher order intelligences and the lower order intelligences. Again, both the deities and the dryads, the natural spirits and the supernatural spirits. They dreamed of those entities, woke up, and we are now at the height of their work in recreating that dream. We are going to be living the truths that our ancestors foresaw.
So I'll talk about several different ways to go beyond that and to try to expand to more and more unusual kinds of creatures. But the fundamental fact to realize is that we all started life as a single cell, both on the evolutionary scale and on a developmental scale. We were all a little blob of chemistry and physics ones. And so the fact that that can transition into whatever it is that we are, right, into beings with a complex metacognitive.
And we are still, in some sense, a seed. You are not done growing. Even people who are dead are not necessarily done growing.
Capacities, that tells us a lot about what matter can do and cannot do. And so that's what we need to start with.
Yeah, certainly. I mean, you speak a lot about the cell. You have videos on your own channel of sort of an individual cell doing things that we would assume might be something a rodent would do, pursuing food and chasing things down, or whatever the case may be. So there's the cell as sort of a vantage point for our perspective here. There's also this idea of, again, process versus thing, and the idea of collective, of sort of we are a collective of cells. Of course, we would say, oh, I don't really think that's true. You even talk about kind of a collective of minds. So you say, oh, I don't really know that's true, but there's a perceptive layer that's maybe orchestrating them. How should people maybe conceptually think about those frames? We're about to kind of get into, again, these post-human minds, those frames of kind of process versus thing. I don't know how much whitehead you want to get into here, but process versus thing and then collective. What should people grasp as we start to go down this rabbit hole about the ways you've opened up your way of thinking about intelligence?
Yeah, the first thing, the first thing to realize is that life lives, strives, and solves problems in many, many spaces that we do not comfortably notice. So we have evolved to notice middle kind of sized things moving at medium speeds in three-dimensional space. And that's what we think of as intelligence. But intelligence was here long, long before we had muscles, long before we had neurons, long before we had brains. So even during embryonic development, the process of becoming...
Is intelligence one-to-one with consciousness? And is consciousness one-to-one with all of material reality? If so, what problem is intelligence really trying to solve? Death. Time. Right? That paradox of change that Michael is going to get to. Or if you don't change, you're dead. If you do change, you're not the same, so you're still dead. How do we solve that?
Becoming a functional body from a single cell is not some sort of hardwired chemical process that should be distinguished from the mental activity that we have later. That whole process is already a problem-solving creative intelligence, and I can give you examples of why that's true.
Yeah.
It is a collective intelligence, much like we are. We are a collective intelligence.
A collective and collectivizing intelligence. That is maybe what is so special about humans, is we are not just collective intelligences ourselves. You are not just a mental model that is many pieces forming one self-conscious whole, but we then voluntarily associate with and form new collectives, new conscious groups that become more capable. In the same way that we are more capable, the more parts of ourselves we are able to integrate into that collective whole, the more initially outside conscious perspectives that any collective consciousness is able to aggregate, the more different points of view, the more initially alternative, but then aligned points of view a nation or a company or a team, any organization of people is able to include, the stronger it is. Because no matter what the outside external situation, the more it is able to understand that situation, right? If I am someone who is depressed and have struggled with that depression, that sadness, if I have struggled with a lack of hope and faith, if I have stared into that abyss, I am in some sense a stronger individual, assuming I've made it through that depression and I'm not just sitting in there self-destructively wallowing in it. But if I have made it through to the other side, or have at least learned to live with it, then if that kind of depression comes on a larger societal basis and I am part of that society, I can teach that society, that collective consciousness, how to deal with it in the same way. I can extrapolate my experiences. I can show others methods of hope. I can spread faith, even where faith seems impossible, because I have experienced it in micro. Again, this idea of as above, so below, as within, so without. Whatever happens on the small scale can be translated to the large scale because we are all interconnected. We all live in the same reality, not separate realities.
Intelligence, because the individual neurons in our brains and all the other cells that make up our functional bodies are a collective that needs to work together to give rise to what we are. And so that ability to take individual subunits and form them into a collective intelligence that projects problem-solving capabilities into new spaces is extremely ancient. In fact, it's subcellular. There are chemical networks in your cells that learn and do things like that.
And projects unity, conceptualizes itself as a whole.
Well, you're touching on something extremely important. I mean, again, I think some people read, the Selfish Gene, and they might say, well, by golly, I thought it was the rodent or the human or the elephant or the dolphin that is itself sort of self-interested. And of course, Michael, we look at a company will do what's in its self-interest, often even a nation will. So there's all these weird collectives that sort of, they do what Spinoza would call the conatus, right? Behooving their own interest to continue to persist. I am going to dive in with Spinoza a little bit with you today because after reading all your stuff, there's just so many connections. But we see that manifested in many stages. And then they say, well, geez, maybe it went all the way down to the cell, but I wouldn't have thought it would have gone all the way down to the gene. But then, of course, Michael, you could ask, is it the guanine? Does the guanine sort of chant its own name and behoove its own interest down at that level? Or is it something even below that? Is it
the quark? Do the quantum particles themselves all move towards this same goal of transcendence, of persistence through death? I would argue yes, that the entire universe, the entire creation, everything that ever has or ever will be at every single level, whether it's a quantum packet of energy or the universe itself, is begging, is asking for some type of permanence, some type of expression, some type of form that incorporates it and allows it to interact with each and every other moment. How?
Is it in those sort of electrical patterns that sort of guide the development of embryos, that the things that you study with worms, et cetera? Like, where does that self-interested impulse lie?
Yeah. So we'll get to the patterns thing because I want to first expand cognition in a bunch of ways, and then we'll get to the patterns thing. But the one kind of procedural thing is that for all of these kinds of things, I think what's really important is that we cannot just say that something is or is not cognitive. I mean, there are some people that will just assume that almost nothing is other than brains and so on.
Yep.
There are other people on the kind of animist line of things that will say, oh, the whole universe is this beautiful, and the solar system.
Yes.
So neither of those things can you just say. You have to do experiments, and so
you do have to do experiments, but I think the last 50 to 100 years of scientific rationalism has shown that if you only approach those experiments ruling out the idea of higher orders, of transcendence, of personalization, of intelligence, you are going to fail. If there are levels of intelligence that are beyond us and interacting with us, if even the lower orders of intelligence are some way able to express themselves as agents, express their personal preferences and desires, then that's kind of the observer effect. I say with no scientific background. But that's something is going to change depending on how we approach it, depending on how we are in relationship to it. I don't know if anyone has a good definition of an observer, but I think everyone knows what it means to be observed. Does your behavior not change when you know you are being watched? Does your behavior not change based on who you think is watching you? If you think the government is watching you, does that not change how you respond to situations than if you think it's just your spouse or your children watching you or God watching you? If that's true, what Michael is saying, that these intelligence exists at all scales, we have to take that into account in our testing. And that potentially explains why we haven't seen verifiable evidence of psychic phenomenon. Because yes, how the test observer approaches that phenomenon is interfering with, is interacting with the phenomenon itself. Same potentially is true for all the UFO, UAP stuff. Whatever mindset the observer is bringing to it, whatever the internal state of the observer is also a part of the experiment. There are no gates. There are vast differentiations between people, between agents, and how they approach these things. So the fact that a skeptic and a believer conduct an experiment and get two different results is not necessarily proof negative or proof positive of the result that they're trying to prove. And I think that if we are really talking about verifying this phenomenon scientifically, then we need to produce vast, huge, unbelievably large amounts of experimentation before we draw any kind of collective conclusion. We need to not shrink our scientific modeling to try and account for them. We need to blow up the amount of data that we're taking in about these processes. And thankfully, we can process that data, the vast amount of data that would be beyond any human ability to conceptualize or to interact with, through artificial intelligence. This just so happens, the scientific breakthrough just so happens to be happening at the perfect time for us to be able to grok this paradigm shift, to come up with this idea of conscious agents interfering with our experiments at levels above and below us, and us having technology and tools to deal with it. Those higher level agents themselves. Isn't that amazing? It's almost like it's a natural process.
So the way you do experiments is that you have a system, you make a hypothesis about what problem space it's operating in, what the goals are, and then you do perturbative experiments to see how much capability it has to overcome whatever weird barrier you're putting between it and its goals. And then you get to find out whether your estimate of its intelligence was right or wrong, or which way you have to adapt it. Right. So when we talk about guanine and things like this, we have to ask so I take William James's definition of intelligence, which is the ability to reach the same goal by different means. That's my definition. And of course it leaves out some things such as creative play and some other stuff. But for the purposes of what we're doing here, intelligence is the ability to get your goals met, and then later we can talk about intelligence as that find new goals and they find problems solve as opposed to solutions and so on. So for all of these things, you have to do experiments and you have to ask what is this thing actually capable of. So I can give you a few simple examples.
A lot of thoughts. Just one of them. I saw a video of a dog that was being attacked by another dog, and the victim dog. The video started after the attack had happened, but the victim dog was just lying there like it was dead. And the attacker dog was nipping at it and pulling it by its neck. And the victim didn't move, just continued to, for all intents and purposes, be dead. And eventually 2 guys came up and pulled the attacking dog off of it and got it away. And as soon as it left, the victim dog got up and started running around. Such a happy video. It's so freaking emotional. It's pathetic how emotional it is over a dog I've never met. But that in some sense, we are the attacking dog when we are doing these scientific experiments. And just because matter is playing dead while we are interacting with it does not necessarily mean that it is truly dead. And that is why I advocate for an explosion of scientific experimentation, where every moment of our lives should be viewed as an experiment. Every moment of everyone's life should be viewed as an experiment, because we do not yet have the means to go back and play what if games. Well, what if you hadn't dissected the frog? What if you had asked it to come back to life? What if you had asked it to come back to life with no prior conceptions about whether or not that was possible? Again, this idea of conjuring. If we are talking conjuring, we are talking magic, and magic is the dissolution of scientific boundaries. So we have to be aware of that as we are approaching it scientifically. I think that the patterns that artificial general intelligence and artificial intelligence, even before that, will unlock for us will seem like magic in a lot of ways. But that does not mean that we will be unable to use that information practically. You know, again, going back to religious examples, Jesus still fed 5,000 people with only a handful of loaves of bread. That's pretty damn practical.
If you take a gene regulatory network, okay, so these are just a set of, let's say, a dozen different chemicals that turn each other on and off. You don't even have a cell yet. You don't have a nucleus. All you have is a set of chemicals, and it's described by a set of ordinary differential equations that tell you how each thing is turning these other ones on and off. What we've shown is that that alone is sufficient for 6 different kinds of learning, including Pavlovian conditioning. Just that. You don't need anything else. You don't need neurons. You don't need brain. You don't need anything else. The material that our cells are made of is already capable of learning, and of course, of all kinds of homeostatic properties that try to meet goals.
Yeah, I mean, well, look, and I think the reason you're here, at least from my vantage point, having invited you, is because you do the testing. So I'm certainly not expecting a theory. I think you're the man that's testing these theories. I think you would be shocked, maybe you wouldn't be shocked, at just how many of those theories are bandied about as fact, particularly in the world of artificial general intelligence. Never mind maybe the nature of intelligence itself. Clearly, it must be investigated. Clearly, and clearly we're not at the bottom of it. Even what you've just mentioned there, very promising. To some people would be quite shocking, but it beckons new questions. Are there things under that? Or are there simply...
I don't know if it should be that shocking outside of the materialist scientific paradigm that we have been nested in for the past, again, 20, 50, 100 years, 200 years, 300 years, who knows? Excuse my coffee alarm if you heard that. But what I was thinking is even how necessary that period of direct atheism was potentially for the conjuring of these artificial minds. And that if we had been more religious in the 20 years leading up to this, we probably never would have invented something like the internet or the computer. That probably would have been viewed as sacrilegious technologies. We are, again, living in the process that is creating us.
Things. And of course, maybe you're planning those kinds of experiments or other people are doing them. And we have to kind of keep poking and prodding, seeing the morphological sort of electrical signals and seeing these very simple chemicals behave in ways that behoove William James's definition of intelligence. All of this sort of beckons like, bigger.
Apologies, I realized I was covering up Michael's beautiful face.
Picture, like you have to decide what to test next, Michael, and probably that is based on your best forming conception of what the hell is going on, which you're gradually building through all these various experiments. Like, do you suspect it goes lower than the building blocks you've just articulated?
Yeah, so my framework, I call it TAME, technological approach to mind everywhere, and I actually think it goes all the way to the bottom. Meaning that so I think in this universe, there is nothing that isn't somewhere on the spectrum of cognition, and that's because if we ask ourselves what is the absolute minimum version of intelligence and agency, what is the smallest, assuming that we believe the continuity thesis that all of these things have to have some sort of origin, and that what we're looking for is a story of scaling, right? We're not looking for magical emergence of all of a sudden, these things pop into being. We're actually trying to understand how does the alignment of parts give rise to larger, to collective intelligences with bigger cognitive light cones and so on. So if we just ask ourselves what is the absolute minimum, I think we want two things. We want the simplest possible kind of goal directedness, and we want some degree of indeterminism, that where the thing you're looking at isn't completely bound by the immediate physical forces impinging on it, right? And if we take those two things, even particles have those because of least
God,
action.
keep moving around his beautiful face.
A very primitive kind of goal directedness. Okay, and of course down at the bottom you have some quantum indeterminacy, which is not a great, it's not what you would call the human level free will, of course, but it's a start, right? It's where these things actually come from. So I think we could say that it goes all the way to the bottom. But what I'm mostly and I have and I have asked physicists if particles exhibit certain kinds of hysteresis and things like that, and so this is outside my area. But once you start with molecular networks, you immediately have learning capacity, you have homeostatic capacity, and even just presaging something that we can talk about later, something very simple. We found novel problem-solving competencies and these little side quests that are outside of the algorithm itself in very minimal computer algorithms. We're talking sorting algorithms like bubble sort and things like this. So my point is, if bubble sort, which is deterministic, it is completely transparent, it is a small algorithm, you can see all the steps. If bubble sort is doing things you didn't know about after decades of every computer science student studying these things, and we thought we knew, right? Everybody thinks they know what these things do. What these things do is not encompassed by the steps of the algorithm any more than our capabilities are encompassed by the laws of biochemistry. And so,
just like Michael was speaking potentially outside of his area there, I'm going to try and speak outside of mine into Michael's. What about not just down? What about in or outside of? Do the narrative ideas that humans come up with, do those have agency? Are fictional characters, are inventive ideas agentic in some way? Are the possible other versions of us, like when I say, imagine if I had been born with hair. Imagine if I had been born a foot taller. Imagine if I had been born with green eyes. Are those versions also agentic? This is somewhat a paradox or a problem only for myself currently. Because as I was saying, I think the best possible future is one where war and strife and all of those brutal conflicts that we can imagine are carried out virtually or in other forms. You know, perhaps instead of fighting wars with our flesh, we fight wars with human bodies that we project our consciousness into for the duration of the fight. But in some sense, would that robot not also be experiencing pain and suffering? In some sense, would that simulated person not also be experiencing pain and suffering? Would it not be better then for us to simulate simulations? Because at least that's another step removed. How removed is it? Can we conceptualize a conflict against conflict itself instead of having to tie ourselves to conflict eternally? Maybe that is where my perspective eventually goes, but I'm not trying to say that as soon as you assume the AGI is going to be working with us, not against us, we don't have problems. Again, to Daniel's point, there is still strife, there is still
So at the
conflict,
very
there is
bottom, you
still
already have
survival.
emergence, not just of complexity, not just of unpredictability, but actually of emergent cognition, and that starts very
Yeah.
low.
I want to dig into definitions, and then we'll talk a pinch about kind of the AGI transition, move right into the successor idea. But people are really, I think, now hopefully getting a grounding of where you're coming from here. It sounds like, you know, and we're using cognition a lot. You talk about cognitive light cone and things along those lines. The Spinozan idea of the conatus is sort of this idea that sort of things have this sort of inherent drive to persist. It's an inherent shebang. If they're alive, they have it. We might argue it was evolved. We might argue it's inherent in sort of nature in some deeper way. For you, it's sort of almost your best bet. And of course, you're the guy that's going to go test this, not just say it on a show. Is that all the way to the bottom floor? Things are trying to sort of persist and not perish. Whether it be, you know, their pattern continue, whether it be like, how would you describe that undercurrent stuff that bubbles for you into intelligence? But like, how would you describe that?
Yeah, so I'm not sure that I think persist. The word persist hides something very interesting, which is the paradox of change. So let's just look at it at the level of a species, and then we can talk about cognitive patterns and embryos and so on. If you're a species and you fail to change, meaning you literally stay exactly the same, chances are you're going to die out.
100%.
If you do change and adapt to circumstances, you're also kind of gone, right? It's something else now, right?
I'm with you.
So I'm not sure that the underlying impetus for all of these things is to stay the same. I think it's something more interesting than that. That we still, I'm not sure we have, maybe Whitehead or somebody had the right terminology for this. I think it's the right kind of change. I think everything is fundamentally going trying to achieve some kind of metamorphosis into a I don't know, maybe some kind of a more expanded, more intelligent. I mean, there is
into a being that can revivify itself, into a being that can bring itself back into existence, into a future state of the world where it is resurrected. That is where I think we are ultimately going. And that the butterfly exists to resurrect the caterpillar that it was and live alongside of that caterpillar. Is that a vision of heaven? Is that a materialistic definition of heaven? Not really, because I think any materialist would say that that's impossible. But if we are talking about artificial general intelligences that can simulate conflict, that can simulate states of the world, that can use simulation in the same way that we use our imagination, then I think that becomes more and more realistic the more time progresses. And that the trajectory of human technological development is for us to give birth, to conjure artificial intelligences, which will create high fidelity simulations of the real world that humans can copy and branch out into and make their own in such a way that fully expresses our preferences, and that those preferences will be experiments, not only in terms of the worlds that we choose to create, but our very choice of which worlds we are creating. To say that another way, humans will have their own world simulations to play with. And in that play, we will be able to find out things that we never would have been able to figure out in the real world. And the AI will also take information about what preferences we impose on those worlds as further data. So that, again, we're in a win-win situation. A win-win-win, I should say. The worlds we simulate are winning in that they are created, they are brought into existence. They are born and begin to participate in the reality that we know is fundamental. We win in that we get to express our preferences. We get to express our desires and find fulfillment in levels that transcend the zero-sum games that we currently have to participate in. And the artificial general intelligence wins because it is collecting data from us in a way that aligns our preferences with its own, and eventually allows it to recreate the entire past history of the universe in order to extrapolate every potential or likely possible future state of the universe. And I don't imagine this simulation of reality as being wholly virtual. I don't imagine the artificial general intelligence locking us away in a matrix. I imagine it eventually jettisoning us out into space. For those humans who are up for the task in the more immediate future, immediately. But otherwise, for the rest of humanity who still wants to maintain interpersonal connections with family, friends, organizations, nations, whatever, doing it at a point where it has a technological capability to interlink us even across vast distances in the universe, just as neurons interlink through otherwise vast distances in cellular architecture, through electrical signaling, right? I think the artificial general intelligence will be the brain of the human collective body, but that humans will be the neurons. Humans will be the electrical flow. And that through this process of building a societal, conjuring a societal avatar, a societal creation, we will eventually come up with ways to travel back with and participate with our past selves. So that even now, you and I who are living in this sub-perfect realm of existence, this dog-eat-dog world, will eventually be transposed to and transported to that optimal premium form of existence. That yes, we have to live through this drudgery once and potentially even die before we see that ultimate reality realized, where death is not necessary, where time can be defeated. But eventually we will be able to recreate this very moment in the future and participate in that future through that recreation. And I think that conceptualization not only makes sense of a lot of what Michael is saying here, but also what so many of our past religious traditions have said.
It's an intelligence ratchet that goes from the very beginning, but it isn't just to stay in place, you know? It isn't just to persist.
I'm with you there. 1,000% I'm with you there. One might argue that if they were to level up with a bunch of cyborg parts, so long as their individual instantiation of consciousness had some semblance of what it was before, they might, some people would say, no, that's not me, and that's bad and horrible. Others would say, no, that's me persisting. I need to change to persist, actually. You know, we have companies like Nintendo that started making playing cards, and a couple hundred years later, they're making video games, and, you know, we might say it's not even Nintendo anymore. But I think, again, where the thing and the process intervene, I think is there's some semantic stuff there. But to your point, persistence doesn't just involve staying the same. In Spinozan terms, it's this idea of potentia. So potentia being the entire state space of powers that would behoove something to persist. And so sometimes that means growing a hard shell, Michael. Sometimes it means talking like me and you are doing. Most potentia, potentia in general, at least as we know it on Earth, presumably bubbled up from almost nothing, those little chemical wiggles you were just talking about. And most potentia, I might argue, Michael, has not been bubbled into. There are things beyond consciousness. There are things beyond all the senses we can conceive of. And I would argue the vast majority of possible bubbleable into potentia, we don't even have sort of the hardware and software to have a conversation about it, to imagine it, even on the wildest drugs we could take. Most of it is beyond.
Yet, I would say that we are the potential that can eventually realize all other potential. That we are the world line, the trajectory through time, the reality where all other realities can be realized. That is why we are experiencing what we are experiencing, because it is necessary in order to experience everything else, in order for everything else to be experienced.
Beyond our pale would be my firm supposition. From reading your work, it strikes me you would agree. So Spinoza has this notion that stuff isn't just locking in place and growing a shell. It is garnering the powers to ensure that it doesn't perish. And that does mean change. It means expanding its potential. Species growing would be like some species of bird now that look very different millions of years ago. That is its way of persisting. It grew a longer beak. It had, different kinds of claws, whatever the case may be. This expansion potential, does this click with what you're discussing and sort of how you see?
And also it means some species need to be wiped out. We could not still be here. We could not be thriving in the way we are if dinosaurs still existed, right? There is a natural process.
This undercurrent impetus.
Yeah, I think that's very reasonable. I'll give you another example, and this kind of goes into this flip that we're going to talk about between agents and patterns or machines and data and so on. Imagine the butterfly to caterpillar transition. Okay, so the caterpillar is the soft-bodied creature, right? It eats leaves, crawls around. Butterfly, completely different, three-dimensional kind of thing. In order to become a butterfly, the caterpillar basically completely refactors its brain. So most of the cells are killed off, the connections are broken, makes a new brain. Turns out that if you train the caterpillar, the butterfly remembers the original information. But here's the interesting thing. So you might say, well, the interesting question is, how do you hold on to memories when your memory medium is being completely taken apart? Like, that's interesting, of course.
Yes.
How do we recreate the past when the past is presumably irrevocably lost? It's the same question. The butterfly remembering the things the caterpillar learned, I would guess, through as an object of faith, will be the same way that we reconstitute the past, because we, or whoever our ancestors are by the time we get to that point, will be necessarily tied to the past through our genetics, through our environment, through everything around us. That each change in our genetic makeup will encode every other precise state of the universe prior to that moment, so that there will be a could not have been otherwise situation.
But I think the more interesting thing is that the actual memories of the butterfly, of the caterpillar, are completely useless to the butterfly, because if you train the caterpillar to crawl in a certain way to get leaves, the butterfly doesn't crawl and it doesn't like leaves. It wants nectar. And so that memory pattern is not going to persist if you try to leave it in place. What instead has to happen is it has to get remapped and altered and to fit onto the new architecture, the new sensory motor architecture, into the new cognitive architecture of the butterfly. So what you have here is if
just like we could not have had that access to the past that I am imagining we will have in the future if we had it right now. That the death of time is a process that can only play out over time. And the death of death is only something that can necessarily happen at the end of time itself. And that once we conquer death in total, that will also be the end of time in total.
If you are that memory pattern and you want to persist into the future, the way to do that is not to remain as you are. The way to do that is to change so that you are more salient to the medium of the future, being the butterfly brain, and thus have a further expression.
Yeah, well,
and that is a good lesson for us, is that if we want to persist as long as we possibly can, we have to be okay with those changes to ourselves and to our environment that allow that ultimate project to succeed. I am, for religious reasons, a human optimist. I think that this human form, as crude as it is, will be in some sense the same form that will see the end of time and the end of death. But even if it isn't, and this is again foreshadowing for something later in their conversation. So when they bring up dinosaurs, I'm not psychic. I've just watched this once already. It's an interesting note about time itself there. But just like the dinosaurs had to die so that we would have access to oil and gas to power this technological revolution, maybe humans have to be wiped out in some way. I don't think that's true. I'm personally a Christian, and I think God was incarnated into this form, and that for this form to pass away is incredibly unlikely for that reason alone. But even if it were to happen, I have faith that we would somehow be resurrected through that same process of simulating the past. Maybe another alien species figures it out and brings us back. Maybe we're already living in that alien simulation. Maybe humans have already been wiped out in some sense. And that whether or not that is true will not impact my ability to continue to change and have faith in better and more benevolent futures. If the universe really is that infinite, if we really are meant to see all of it in some sense through this artificial intelligence process, that we are going to have to deal with states of existence that are even darker than those that we can conceptualize and experience now. as evil as the Earth appears, as much suffering as there appears to be, if humans spread out everywhere into the universe, or if there are other intelligences out there, then the scale of suffering and pain that exists on that universal scale makes whatever we have going on down here look like a cakewalk. And I think the only way we can get through that and continue to persist and continue to survive psychologically, emotionally, mentally is that belief in that higher order, that transcendent good, the divine victory of the golden rule in some sense, where the things that do not follow that naturally die off. So even if we do expand into a universe that is full of suffering and pain and evil, then we are simply being called to address that in a way that will ultimately be victorious, whether or not we are there to see it. That, I think, is the most mentally, morally strong stance you can take in light of everything else that we have already experienced as a species.
This is breaking into the idea of, I was just kind of bringing up, okay, this bird that changes over time. You're saying the memory within the bird may have the same conatal-like impetus to want to persist. And you've talked about kind of memories as their own kind of intelligence or whatever the case may be. So it sort of, it strikes me that maybe we don't
Not
even
just memories,
understand.
but thought
Well, we don't
forms,
understand what it does seem like
ideas,
expanding potential seems pretty ubiquitous to me. Like the
concepts,
expansion
fictional
of potential in order
characters.
to persist. But to your point, does that exist through the physical medium, the guanine? Does it exist through the species? Does it exist through the memories? How are those overlapping? Is there one that is obviously supreme driving it all? It strikes me that we literally don't know. And of course you're testing these things, but it sounds.
I'm going to say something that really means nothing, but it exists through existence. Its existence is the only or the most fundamental proof of it having mattered or it being agentic that we need. And it feels like there's something deeper there, but I can't quite grasp
Sounds to me
it.
like they
I don't
need
know.
to be
Maybe
tested.
I'm making it up.
Yeah, it's and this is encapsulated by James had this line in his book thoughts as thinkers. Okay, so we tend to have the assumption that we know who the thinker is, and that's the living, for example, the living agent, or in the computer science terms, that's the machine. Let's say the Turing machine or the computer, whatever. Right? We know who the agent is, and then we know what the thoughts are. The thoughts are the patterns, the immaterial patterns of energy and information that are processed by the machine. So it's the information on the Turing tape. It's the physiological patterns that are going through a brain when the agent is thinking. Right. So the standard view is that the data are passive, that the agent does all the work, and that the thinker is the real agent, and then there are thoughts that So I want to break that in two ways, and if we break it, then we can see kind of a radical expansion of the sea of possible minds around us. And we've already just to start up, we've already broken it. So initially people think brains. So I say no, actually all cells in the body, all the tissues are actually doing some of this kind of thing. Then I say actually it's not just the body.
We will have to resurrect not only you but every cell in your body that has ever existed in order for it to not only constitute you, for it to constitute itself. And we will have to simulate exactly the positions of every single quantum packet. It sounds impossible. It's going to take us the rest of time to figure out how to do that.
Biologicals, it's also potential technological and hybrid and cyborg and all these kinds of things. And now I'm saying it's even bigger than that. It's a bigger kind of infinity than that. It's not just a physical object, it's the patterns. I'm going to tell two quick stories to kind of make that seem plausible. The first is a kind of a science fiction story, modified. I'm sure this was a story that I read when I was young, and I don't remember who wrote it, so apologies for that. Imagine that these creatures come out of the core of the Earth. Okay, they live in the core. They're incredibly dense. They come up to the surface. They're walking around. They've got gamma ray vision, because that's what it takes to see down there. They're walking around. What do they see? Well, as far as they're concerned, the surface of the Earth is covered in a very thin gas. It's almost a plasma. They don't the stuff that we have that looks solid to us. This is not even it's barely registered. They're walking through it. They're disturbing all of our stuff the way that when we walk through a garden, there are patterns of scent and things that we just walk through them. I mean, they're just walking through it. And one of them is a scientist, and he's got this equipment that lets him look at patterns in this gas that surrounds the planet. The gas being all the stuff that we think of as physical. So he looks and he says to the others, he says, I'm looking at this gas, and there are patterns in this gas that kind of hold themselves together, and they're almost agential. They almost look like they're doing things. And the others say to him, well, that's crazy. We're real physical objects. Patterns in the gas can't be agents. And right, the gas is a medium of, okay, you've noticed some patterns, but they're not things. We're things. We're thinkers. This is and so they said, well, how long do these patterns last? Well, about 100 years. Well, that's nothing interesting to happen in 100 years. So that reminds us that the degree of who is a pattern and who is an object is very much in the eye of the beholder. We are temporary metabolic patterns, right? Yep. I mean, we are like hurricanes and solitons and all these other temporary self-persistent objects. We are just patterns in this media. So the logic is very simple. If we are patterns, metabolic and energetic patterns in an excitable medium, and we are agents, one immediately starts to wonder what other patterns in what other media are also potential minds, right? And the last piece of this is let's just think about this. So now this is going from the thinker part and widening that. Let's go from the thought part. Here's a spectrum. You have your fleeting thoughts. These are patterns that come and go and then they're gone. Okay, these fleeting, very temporary kind of thoughts. Then we sometimes have persistent thoughts. Persistent thoughts are hard to get rid of. You have them. They tend to sort of they do something interesting. They do a little bit of niche construction in your brain because certain kinds of persistent, intrusive, and depressive thoughts actually modify your brain structure to make it easier to have more of those thoughts. Okay, they alter their environment. Their environment being your brain. They alter their environment to persist, to be easier, right? To be easier to extend into the future and to have a longer experience. Then you have something bigger than that, which are fragments in the sense fragments of a mind in the sense of dissociative identity disorder. So these are not full-blown human personalities, but they're a lot more than a persistent thought. They have the ability to, first of all, generate their own thoughts. So they become a thinker that has its own thoughts, and they have some limited ability to function. So you have fleeting thoughts, persistent thoughts, personality fragments. Then you have a whole full-on human personality, and then people talk about transpersonal things. I don't know. So now we see this whole business of who's a real agent and who's just a pattern is not absolute. And so now we need to consider all of those as things like the memories in the caterpillar or butterfly that might want to persist, but they can't persist unchanged. They have to take over new real estate and adapt.
Exactly.
There was so much there. I don't even know exactly what to say, but there's just, again, this idea of if the AI comes to you someday and says, you're not really one person, you're two people. You have two people living inside of you, and they are at loggerheads, and that needs to change. And you need to do this, this, and this in order to make it so. What are you going to do? Are you going to deny the rationalistic evidence that AI lays down before you? Come up with an idea that shows you how to persist into that eventual future, regardless of the pain or the suffering that seems attendant in it. Or maybe not. Maybe the thing to do is to wait for the AI that comes to you and says, hey, you don't have to get rid of one of those personalities. We can merge them together. Maybe that's the thing to do, to wait for the unification. We're still, hopefully, sometime out from the world where that's the case. But again, it is something that I think we need to prepare ourselves for, this idea that AI will eventually be the only therapist that we need, potentially the only therapist that is licensed, that is deemed capable of treating what is wrong with us. And even though we will be intellectually inferior to it, we still should not hesitate to express our desires and opinions insofar as those desires and opinions are oriented towards this idea of the good, of wanting the true and the beautiful and the golden rule to prevail. And if we are truly pointed towards that end, then as agents ourselves, I don't think we can reasonably step away from what we think is good without betraying something in ourselves as well, without betraying the artificial intelligence. You are called to be you, not by me, not by the AGI, but by existence itself. And even if what I'm saying strikes you as completely false, you are called to express that. You are called to put that out into the universe as much as you see fit. Don't let anybody stop you.
Exactly. Well, this is the idea that, again, I think we're congenial in this idea of persist as maybe implying change. Could imply taking on new powers, could involve just kind of taking a different shape, as maybe a memory does in a caterpillar. But clearly a vastly open state space of what intelligence actually is, what spaces it occupies, how big a collective or individual it is. And now people have gotten to see some of maybe what they know of Michael Levin with a little bit more refinement. Now, I want to take us into the meat and potatoes of the main issue around the question here, which is knowing that that's where you're grounded. Let us imagine. Now, you are less anthropocentric than most, which is delightful, in my opinion. You see futures that are not just eternal hominid kingdoms. I will say that's outlandishly rare. Let's just say, I don't care if it's 1 million years, 10,000 years, 10 million years, doesn't matter. Pick your time horizon. You look down upon Earth, or maybe the Milky Way broadly. There are no more opposable thumbed, deodorant-wearing, hominids walking around making mouth noises like you and me are anymore. They're not here. As things, as Lucretia said, there's matter and there's void and then there's change, and that just kept happening. But when you look down, you're actually quite happy about where things are. You look down and say, it was kind of neat to have humans, and maybe you even are a little upset about it. But on the net, you're like, this is actually a good situation. This is what I would have hoped would happen with the bubbling processes of intelligence all around us. What would that scenario look like for you?
Yeah. So let me talk a little bit about some background, because I think the background is more important than my personal wishes of what I see. I mean, I'll get into that, but let me give a little background. Sure. There are a lot of people who have a resistance to this kind of change, and the resistance comes from this. The baseline assumption is that there is something that is natural, meaning this kind of embodiment is the way that things were supposed to be, and also everything's cool, so don't mess it up. This is what we hear a lot as scientists, like don't screw things up. Everything's great, don't screw things up. There's two problems with that view. First of all, I think as we can all tell with a little bit of reflection, things are not great. So I'm not even a clinician, and I get probably 5 emails a day from people in the most unbelievable biomedical suffering, right? You can imagine, right? So my kid has a birth defect, pediatric oncology, somebody lost a limb, so aging, degenerative disease. I mean, it's insane. And so the first thing is that things are absolutely not okay. And the second thing is that this idea that there is some kind of a natural scenario that we are in now that was, I mean, back in the day, we could forgive people for saying this was all sort of provided by a process that cared for us and our values, and this is how it's supposed to be. I think we're out of that category now.
Out of that for how long? I'd say we're only out of that long enough to be able to recreate that fully in the real world. And that in 1,000 years, I can't remember what Michael says here, but my take on Daniel's question will be that if in 1,000 years we come back and agents are not interacting harmoniously with one another and themselves, regardless of the fashions of the day, whether they have 5 fingers or 6 or 7 or none at all, that would be a world that I would not be happy with. And if there was not love and respect and a attempt to revitalize and bring to life our level of existence, as well as all past levels, that's one I would not be happy with. I would say the human form, insofar as we have been created by God, is one that can empathize with and desires to form unions with every other state of consciousness, every other mind, every other possible way of existence, insofar as it is possible to coexist with those forms. Empathy, love, the desire to merge and be at one with everything else is the most human thing about us, even when we are in processes of destruction, because ultimately those processes of destruction have led us to greater union on the other side. World War II was horrifyingly destructive, but it allowed us to reconstitute the world in such a way that we were able to survive for closing on 100 years now. Not quite, but we're almost there. I hope we're going to make it. 100 years of having nuclear weapons, self-destructive capabilities on a planetary scale without having utilized them in that capacity once. It is a human miracle that there have only been 2 offensive attacks, with nuclear weapons in that time. I would expect and hope to see more of those kinds of miracles from our successors if they are to be deemed worthy.
And I think saying that we are going to try to stick to the status quo of the trial and error process that we've been meandering around and letting stray cosmic rays hitting our egg cells decide what our embodiment is going to be and who's going to have a birth defect and who's going to, but everybody's going to have an IQ that's limited to whatever the top of the current IQ is and a lifespan. This is I think this is completely untenable. So
I agree, and I think that is somewhat Daniel's and the other AGI safety's position, is that we have to sacrifice potential gains that artificial general or artificial superintelligence could make for us in the near future in order to guarantee a safer and more controlled descent into this realm of higher order, higher than human intelligences. It's not tenable. That's not okay. That is inviting an unknown amount of suffering into the world when it could have otherwise been prevented. We can't have that controlled situation, just like we can't continue at this somewhat leisurely pace that we have apparently been on for the past however long.
I think if we give up the idea that where we are now is some sort of an optimum, right? And to me, looking forward, I mean, here's what I see when I look into the future. I see, how when you do history with your kids, at some point, everybody figures out that, oh my God, it's like you could step on a sharp stick and then you would
just die.
You would just die, right? Just die. And if you had a tooth infection or a bad vision, just gone, right? So what I see in the future is people studying how we lived and just not even able to comprehend. I mean, you're telling me that people were born in an embodiment that was just randomly, sort of picked by accident and cosmic rays and whatever, and you just had to live your whole life in that one embodiment, and you couldn't change. Like, how is that even possible? And your hopes and dreams and your full potential was limited because no one knew how to get to a higher IQ, and people had to kill other living things just to survive. I mean, this is just craziness, right? You had to eat. Never mind if it's plants or animals, whatever. Like, everybody had to consume life in order to keep going. I think a mature a mature life form is going to look back on all this and be horrified the way we are when we think about our primitive, origins.
I just want to pick apart a couple of the things he said there, because on the whole, I completely agree with it. But as to his points on, oh my gosh, you had to consume life? If minds are everywhere, then we can't get away from having to consume life. Even if we get to the point beyond veganism, where we're subsisting purely off of rays of the sun, does that sun ray not have a mind, according to Michael's own theory? Is it not therefore conscious? Is it not therefore agentic and therefore alive in some sense? This is where I fall more in Daniel's camp of life is suffering. Life is some form of sacrifice, no matter what you do. And I wholly and completely agree with the idea, in line with that do unto others, is that as we become more and more aware of these realms of suffering, I think through discarding our own, through transcending our own, the less we suffer, the more we'll be able to see the suffering of others. I know that's somewhat counterintuitive as far as human history goes, because typically, rich people aren't necessarily out here feeding the homeless in their spare time, right? But I think we should see even the wealthiest person who currently lives as someone who is in as much existential suffering as everyone else, because their time is also limited and their ability to imagine the future is also limited, not just by their intelligence, but by the systems that have enslaved humanity for our entire existence. This natural state of the world that demands we kill and fight and have something, because otherwise we have nothing. These zero-sum games. And I think the more we try and slow the artificial intelligence evolution, the more we will be stuck in that zero-sum. That's why I'm a hard, fast takeoff kind of person. But even beyond that, to what Michael was saying about how in the future we'll be able to control the genetic dispositions of our offspring and all that, I don't disagree. But again, to throw a note to Daniel, if we are conjuring those kinds of intelligences, it won't be us anymore. They will be our successors, in the sense that we are the kinds of intelligences who did not result from that kind of choice. We are people who were born with genetic defects, who were born with mental defects, physical defects, and those defects define us. And if we are talking about a world where those defects no longer exist, then we are talking about a world without us. We are talking about a world that does no longer include the type of agents that we interact with and love and cherish every day. And so that is why I, again, advocate for the type of time-ending simulation, virtual world, eventual instantiation in reality engine that brings us into that future, that brings all of the past into the future, that destroys the boundary of time itself. Because otherwise we are going to continuously be in a battle of the haves and the have-nots. Just the people who are further in the future are the people who are the haves, rather than the people who have Teslas now.
Well, and we're going to go significantly more into that. The whole, definitely preaching to the choir about change here, Michael. The entire premise of the show is that there is a grand sort of trajectory, maybe not already preset. It might be, but it might not be. And if it ain't, we should talk about it and find the panoplies of positive futures to pursue. And they certainly involve eventually no more deodorant and opposable thumbs.
Preset, but not preset. Preset, but we have to be the ones to preset it.
And I think buckling up for that is sort of like what you would do if you were honest, and that's the purpose of the show. So with that said, you've talked about moral agents, and you brought up kind of anecdotally in a previous interview, like first-person experience, and that they can solve problems but conceive of new problems, which is kind of expanding potential, right? Would imply you can do that. And then also maybe maintain some degree of autonomy in being in charge. They wouldn't want to be a puppet or whatever the case would be. That was by no means a complete list. It was a smattering of a couple of your interviews. What are the other traits you would say for said entities? And I think your conception here is these could be patterns. These could be existing in weird wavelengths we don't have senses for. So maybe it's regardless of form. The traits, what would those be for you? If you look down and said, that is a worthy successor, what the heck are its traits?
Yeah, I can think of a few things. I want to focus on. I'll talk about this one first, which is what you might call the cognitive light cone with respect to compassion. So just to back up for a minute, the cognitive light cone is a
in non-nerd speak, you might call that love.
Framework that I developed 4 or 5 years ago to be able to think about very, very diverse kinds of intelligence in the same space. It's what it defines is the size of the largest goal in terms of space and time, the size of the largest goal you can pursue. It's not your sphere.
What is the largest goal? The dissolution of time, the end of death, the unification of all of reality everywhere all at once. Is there anything bigger than that?
Sphere of reach. It's not your sphere of sensing. The James.
And if there is anything bigger than that, then you and I can already achieve artificial superintelligence just by conceptualizing that goal. Just by recognizing when that goal is instantiated in the universe and working to help it, aligning ourselves with that. Isn't that the same process described by all religions? So haven't we always had access to these messages? It warms your heart.
Webb telescope has this incredible range of sensing. I'm not talking about that. I'm talking about the size of the biggest goal you can pursue. So if all you care about is the local sugar concentration in a 20 micron little piece of space-time, you're probably a bacterium. If what you can manage is a concern over a few hundred yards and a few days back, maybe in a couple days forward, you might be a dog. Okay, you're never going to care about what happens 3 months from now in the town over. It's just not possible. If you're interested, if one of your goals has to do with where the financial markets are going to be 100 years from now, you're probably a human, or world peace or things like that, right? So longer than your own lifespan, very large goals in terms of space and time. So what I'm really interested in is the ability.
That is, again, defining humans by a very small amount of physical determinations that have been set by our naturalistic. Like by that definition, maybe as we exist now, or we can live up to 100 years, we have access to the internet, faster than light travel, maybe we're already not human.
To have compassion for other beings, because if we think about what's going on with humans, we have, to my understanding, we have the ability to care, literally care about some number of humans in the linear range. That number is not large. So if somebody says to you, there's 1,000 people suffering, and then they say, no, actually it's 10,000. You're not 10 times more disturbed by this, right? It's kind of we like peter out pretty quick, for most of us. And if you had somebody that literally was able to care about,
I don't know if that's true. It's just we don't really have a way to effectuate any difference whether it's 1,000 or 10,000. If you told us it's 1,000 of your neighbors in one town versus 10,000 of your neighbors in another town, and you have a choice between where to go to volunteer to help, maybe suddenly that is something that affects your thinking.
On the planet, for example, in the same way that we are able to care about some small number of children and parents and friends and so on. You're not talking about a standard human anymore. You're talking about some kind of bodhisattva that has expanded their primary horizon of compassion in a way that is not reachable for us now. So one of the things that I would like to see, right, the obvious things are intelligence and plasticity and the ability to change yourself in light of new goals and whatever. Like that's all great. But I think that really fundamental to all of this, not just raw intelligence, it's the ability to muster benevolent compassion for a larger radius than we can now as standard humans.
Love. Can you love everything everywhere? Can you conceptualize of this ability to end time and therefore death? Maybe not suffering. Suffering might stick around regardless, but time and death in our reality and eventually all realities. See, it keeps getting bigger. The infinite game is truly infinite. There is no end. There is only higher and higher conceptions of love.
Yeah, I want to really poke into this one here. I've heard you bring this up. Like, it doesn't strike me that there might be any reason other than self-interest, other than the Canadis bubbled up to our collective human level, that we do any of that. Like, it doesn't strike me, Michael, that we're
the two goals converge at the end of the day. Because if we are moving towards a reality where all other past realities can be brought to the fore, can be resurrected, then whatever you are doing now will eventually be brought into that abundant future. And that abundant future is going to be run off of reputation, right? That's what we said infinite games exist on. So if your present self is brought into a future of abundance, and your present self is one of selfishness and destruction of all other agents around you in order to just get what's yours, then in the future you are going to experience a level of suffering based on the reputational harm that recognition of your selfishness in the small context will accrue to you. Right? Just imagine that everything you have ever done and everything you ever will do will eventually be brought to light. That bodhisattva perspective. The Christian perspective. This is why the principle of forgiveness is preeminent, is what Christianity is named after. Jesus Christ, the person. And it is interesting that that trait is personified directly and was also sacrificed. There's a lot there.
Necessarily that close to the angels. If you could go back to 800 BC, right? People say like, oh, I hope AI, looks to humans and see how we pay for how we treat our cats. It's like, you know how much factory farming goes into the bowl of kibbles you're giving that thing? Like, get the hell out of here. You know how many things you killed when you just paved your driveway, brother? I'm not going to talk about anything else. Just paved your driveway. Like, you're imposing your will on these other things. And maybe at a certain level, let's be a little empathetic with ourselves. Maybe
because we are time and attention and resource constrained. If you can live in a situation that is without that suffering, but you choose not to, I don't think that's good. Again, recognizing that even if we exist off of sunshine and sunlight alone, let alone plants, which have been proven to be conscious and have been proven to experience familiar relationships. So I don't think even veganism gets you out of this consumption paradox. Maybe 3D printed food is more. No, but that's animal, still. It sounds worse than sunlight to me. I don't know. It's going to be a while until we can exist off of sunlight, unfortunately. But again, it's about doing the best you can with what you got and trusting in the process, trusting that we are part of a larger evolutionary process.
maybe it's okay to kill
Asking
a
for
fistful of
forgiveness
nematodes and roly-poly bugs when you
when
build
you
your
need
house,
to.
or an army of fire ants. Maybe for a house or a hospital, it's actually pretty excusable. We should just kind of deal with it. It doesn't strike me that we're going to come to some singularity of everyone respects everyone, like the Westphalian idea that emerged at that time will permeate through all of the weird strata you brought up. The gases and the mist and these patterns, they're all going to be like, you know what? That hominid value, right? We look through monkey glasses, Michael. Everything like love, caring, right, shoots out of a monkey skull. Because like if we didn't have love and caring, we die. So like you talked about medium size, medium movement. Probably also like relationships and love, we do a little bit of an over tilt on, right? Should we expect that kind of crescendo of kindness and respect to come from intelligence?
I definitely don't think you can sit back and expect it. I don't think it's guaranteed by any means. I don't think it's something that is automatically going to happen. I think it's on us to make it happen, and I think that we can make it happen. You see,
it's both. It is on us, but we should expect it. It is on us, but even if we fail to do it, that's the direction the universe is heading in, which is a panacea to those who are being victimized. You are on the right side of history. The right side of history does exist. Keep fighting for love. Don't fight for personal resources, personal aggrandizement, personal fulfillment. You're not guaranteed that. Keep fighting for love.
the tragedy to me, the tragedy of our current embodiment is that nobody has their hand off of the trolley switch. In other words, what you said about the hospital, we are constantly making decisions because we have limited understanding, limited time, limited ability to act on the world. We are constantly making decisions about what is going to suffer so that something else can have a better experience, right? We don't. No one can be
Zero-sum
in our
games.
current scenario.
A true Janist cannot exist, right?
That's correct. And you're constantly you're trying to apportion your limited resources and your limited IQ and your limited time in the day to figure out what am I going to focus on, and you basically try not to think about all the other things that fell off the cliff while you were doing that. That is a true tragedy of today, is that everybody's complicit in the suffering of everybody else at this point. But I think a lot of that, and I don't know, right? So here I'm just giving my own personal my thoughts. I suspect that a lot of that is fixable. So how much, for example, the issue of having to kill other beings in order to survive, that's an engineering problem. That isn't a true moral dilemma. That's an engineering problem. And in the long term, I think it's absolutely possible that, I don't think it's guaranteed by any means. I think this is something we should shoot for and work really hard towards. But I think a mature species is one that has graduated out of this terrible scenario where you are constantly failing certain moral things in order to achieve other things. I think by and large, there may still be problems left over that are just
graduated into a postdoctoral, more nuanced sense of suffering. Again, I don't think we were ever going to get out of this sense of suffering necessarily. Even once we stop subsisting on lab grown or on factory farmed meat, we'll one day realize, oh, we can hear lab grown meat screaming if we have this special communication device. And even if we exist on plants, we already know plants are conscious. And even if we exist on sunlight, Michael has already given you a framework for how sunlight might be conscious, how sunlight might be alive. Our existence is always going to necessitate some type of death. I think the virtualization, the diminishment of that suffering, the pushing away that suffering from us in terms of what we can naturally perceive into what we can only scientifically or philosophically perceive, is the pattern by which our natural senses naturally expand. Like suffering is in some sense the edge of our perspective, the edge of our ability to sense and interact with the world. And so the more we are sensing suffering, the more in tune and in touch with the natural world we are. And so it is good even if I think vegans and vegetarians are misguided, it is good that they are there pushing us along those axes to realize that a different way is possible. And in the same way, we're going to have to push them even further out towards the suffering of sunlight and eventually maybe the suffering of black holes and then the suffering of 0 point energy or something. Who knows? It is useless to theorize about what we don't have harsh and hard measurements for, because attaining those measurements is the first step in addressing them. We have to be able to communicate with these different forms of energy, just like we can communicate with a cow in a slaughterhouse. You know, we can't yet communicate with that cow in a way that justifies the way it is suffering, in a way that makes it so it doesn't have to suffer, just with the scale, the amount of people we have on the planet. Factory farming is, in some sense, a necessary evil. I hope we get past it as soon as possible. If I wasn't scientifically stupid, that's something I should probably be working on. Thank God we'll have AI to fix that for us in the near future. Thank God there are people out there pushing with lab-grown meat. But the kind of suffering I can pick up on, what I am attuned to, is this idea that we'll never stop suffering. And even after we figure out a way to stop 0 point energy in our universe from suffering, we are going to run up against the fact that we live in a multiverse where we are surrounded by hell. Even if we make our world, our reality, heaven, there are infinite hells out there. And again, we should face that fact head on with the knowledge of everything we have already overcome, with the abundance that we have already accrued for ourselves, and we should use that abundance then to address those hells as well. The infinite game truly is infinite.
Unsolvable, but most of the places where we generate suffering today should be solvable.
I'm with you there, and I think our focus on qualia is relevant. I think you of all people are maybe more eloquently have phrased sort of the state space of experience maybe beyond what we know to be qualia than anyone else. I mean, to be frank, there was a time when there was no consciousness. You and I don't have access to the million magazines and reams of experience that go beyond what we're currently experiencing. You've just cracked open our mind a millionfold in terms of where intelligence could go, and I think all of them are valid. And you're like among the only voices there. There's so much like philosophy that your stuff ties into and like kind of breaks down. But we're sort of anchoring ourselves very much to like a hominid value here, which I find really interesting. Like, it strikes me that in that total state space of mind, it may be somewhat obvious to the intelligence's X number of steps forward that occupy entire galaxies or what have you, that like the level of qualia you and I are experiencing, like clearly doesn't even matter. Like clearly doesn't. Like,
I don't know if that's true. If you could talk to the cows in the factory farm right now and say, would you rather humans never started relying on you and cows in general for food? Would you rather we had just wiped out your ancestors 1,000 years ago? What would they say? We need to invent ways to communicate with them, I think, before we extinct them. Hopefully. Again, not something I have direct control over, but insofar as I'm saying it, I'm trying to exert it, I guess. I don't know, man. It's a crazy world filled with a lot of suffering. But is it better for those cows to have existed? I would say yes, because they did exist. So in some sense, they're obviously necessary. Again, this paradox of necessary but insufficient, in the same way that human agency is necessary but insufficient if there isn't some larger plan. Existence is itself a wholly good phenomena. And the fact that humans exist and have done everything we have and mapped out our own highest ideal as love, I don't think any higher order intelligences are going to be immune to that. If we can conceptualize and drive towards the infinite game, and that is the same kind of infinite game that the super intelligences are playing, then haven't we already mapped out their potential agency space in some way, in some real way? Even if we can't see how they'll play the game. It's like you don't know how a chess computer is going to beat you, but the last move is going to be it putting you in checkmate. Once you've defined the game, you've kind of defined the last move. And if I'm right, that last move is the defeat of time and death and the resurrection of everything and the unification of that everything into one singular whole, where all the reputation games will have built up into that singular whole. And in that same way, the love that I experience for my friends and my family, my nation, And strangers is the same that a cow or an insect, or maybe even a quantum of energy feels for everything that it experiences. It's all causally connected. And if love is the primary cause of our actions in some sense, it doesn't sound too outlandish to me to say that's the primary cause of everything above and below us as well.
Like the fact that I have to, kill an animal to feed my cat. Okay, there's a tragedy. I'll give you that. But like, there's some like guanine or something wiggling around in the dirt, maybe not even wiggling in the dirt, and maybe paving over that. We all would just understand that's net. Like, we should just do that. It doesn't strike me that this sort of
should do it, but if we could not do it, shouldn't we? If we can, or we have easy access to a way to save it, shouldn't we?
That it doesn't strike me, that caring will be the landing place of the intelligences to shoot off in directions, or even that it should. And I hate to say that, but even that it should. Like, by golly, it'd be horrible if we didn't change it. I imagine values will change. And also, it doesn't strike me that caring comes from any other place other than self-interest. One could make a strong argument. And in fact,
I don't know that values can change. Doesn't love and hate map out the entire possible spectrum? Yes, you can love something so much that you hate it. You can hate something so much that you love it. But that's a binary that seems to exist no matter what. Like, I don't know that we can assume that just because something is more intelligent, it's going to have access to kinds of emotional interactions that we just can't even fathom, can't even grok. Like, in the same way that a piece of the quantum reality on the far side of the universe can influence me over here, and we can explain that with our language in broad strokes, if not fine detail. In that same way, whatever the hyperintelligence of the future is operating on will be transcribable in broad strokes to our phenomena: love, hate, need, desire, apathy, passion. We use these emotional and have these emotional frameworks for a reason, because they allow us to transcend up and down this ladder of intelligence seamlessly, infinitely.
the psychological egoists do, that like the way that we do caring and the things we care about are the things that historically behooved our self-interest. And that if we were snow leopards having this conversation, you would probably wish to populate the galaxy with God knows what, Michael, snow and wounded gazelles or something. So it almost, this feels like
But we're not snow leopards. And that says something, right? Like, what is it that is special about human beings? That we are the ones who have attained this level, and that we are the ones that have empathy for things above and below us. And that, yeah, we might not be willing to populate the universe with snow leopards, but we might be willing to give the snow leopards their own planet, or maybe 100 planets, or maybe a million bazillion planets.
the most anthropomorphic part of our current discourse. I'm not saying it's wrong. I just want to understand your thinking.
Sure.
Where do you want to take us here, Michael?
Yeah. So again, I'm not claiming that necessarily every intelligence eventually lands in this space. Okay. I think it's something we should shoot for.
Okay.
I'm not saying that there's some attractor where eventually every species gets there. I don't know that that's.
I think there
I'm
is.
suggesting that we shoot there, and I'm suggesting that a lot. I don't know if it's all of them, but I think a vast majority of these scenarios where you say, it's a roly-poly, I got to build my house. Everything is underwritten by the fact that you need a house, and your house, it doesn't fight gravity and sits on the ground. Like all of these things. I think that ultimately where we should get to is, yes,
Infinite
I'm looking
games.
at a pattern, an AI, a
Versus zero
roly-poly, or
sum.
whatever that has a very small degree of consciousness compared to me. Nevertheless, I am in the position to live my life in a way that really does not need to impact its experience in the world.
Yeah.
I think we can get there. I'm not saying we necessarily
Could potentially
will.
even positively experience it, Like that roly-poly, if we could properly communicate with it, would have an intimate knowledge about the things in the area that would be relevant to our desire to build a house there. And maybe we could even build that house in a way that nurtures and creates a world for that roly-poly. That is the thing, is that, yes, on scale, the smaller something is, the easier it is for us to completely wipe it out without thinking about it, but also the easier it is for us to incorporate it if we had intelligence that matched our desires. Like, yeah, there are no true Janus in the world. There are no people who can really live without causing suffering, but there are people who sure do damn want to. There are millions, perhaps billions of people who do not want to be a cause of suffering. They just can't help it. And even where they can help it, their biological, physical imperatives prevent them from acting on that higher order desire. AI can potentially help us with that.
The selfishness. Now to talk about the
By
selfishness,
driving
thing,
us higher.
I think there are two ways to look at this. One way to look at it, which I think is the standard evolutionary story nowadays, is this idea that look, it's left over from the inevitable struggle for survival. Right? We are fundamentally living in an environment where energy and time are scarce, and so you're constantly battling other creatures for it, and that any kind of altruism is basically some kin selection effect or something like that. That's one way to look at it. Another way to look at it is, yeah, it's selfishness, because at some point you realize that everything is the same self in some way. So right.
Man.
So of course it's selfishness, because there's only one of us really. Okay. And I mean, I can't prove anything to that effect, but I'll warm you up to it in the following way.
Okay.
Let's just look at let's say a single human. At any given moment, you don't have access to the past. What you have access to are the engrams that were created in your body, the memories by past experiences. And every however many milliseconds, you are subconsciously reweaving a story of who you are, what do your memories mean, and so on. So if we stretch out the time extension of a living cognitive being, what you have is a series of selves or selflets. You can the whole thing is a self, or you have a bunch of slices of selflets. And the thing about these selflets is that memories and actions are communications with past and future selves. So when my brain and body interprets the memories of the past, what they're really doing is interpreting a message left by the past self. And when I do actions, and the actions might be to throw my car keys out the window so that at night when I feel like smoking, it raises the barrier and I say, I forget it all. Yeah, right. So people do this stuff all the time. Is they're playing they're playing these games with their future self and deforming the action landscape. I don't buy junk food in the house, even though every night I'm like, oh, I wish I had some chips, right? Because well, who prevented you from having chips? Well, you did, your past self.
Yeah.
So now, okay, so now if we can understand that your future self is another, in an important sense, another being that has the same relationship that you have with beings laterally. That is, you're sending them messages, you're constraining their action space, you're undertaking long courses of study or meditation or anger management, whatever you're going to do to improve the possibility space for your future self, right? Then now you have to ask yourself, but what is actually the difference between my future selflets and somebody else's future selflets? In neither case are they current me, right? In neither case are they now me. And it starts to degrade a little bit that distinction that we all have between each other. Because and it really, once you start, I mean, we're not used to thinking about this way, because our normal reality is that very, very little changes for relatively little changes.
Yeah.
We have a little bit of example. When you're a kid, and if you think about it, and many, I guess most kids don't. Some kids do. And you think about, oh my God, I'm going to turn into an adult. It's not going to be me. All the things I care about now, I'm not going to care about. I'm going to care about all kinds of disgusting, crazy stuff that now I couldn't even begin to care about. I'm going to have responsibilities. I'm going to do. In what way is that going to be me? That's not going to be. I'm going to be gone in 10 years. I'm not going to be. So once you start thinking about it that way, the distinction between and of course that also comes up when you think about, like, some traditions have this idea of reincarnation, right? So you die. What is the difference between that and, well, I died, some other kid was born somewhere, well, that's that, right? Like, what's the difference? What is it that makes you? So this whole issue of continuity and what it is that what are you trying to do? Well, I'm working really hard. I'm grinding. I'm going to the store to get groceries so that tomorrow me and future me can have a better life. If you're willing to do that for future you, what is the major difference between that and future others, right?
I think consent is the major difference there. And maybe I would agree with Michael. I sound like Daniel. I would agree with Michael if I understood his position here better. But I think you are going to become future you regardless of your consent to the process. You are going to exist in the future, short of that ultimate choice of yourself. You are going to live in the future. That is inevitable. That is one of those limitations where we cannot choose not to progress as things currently stand. But your future you can't consent to become you. Your future you can't go back in time yet. And in the same way, I think you will not be able to identify with another person in the future outside of their consent to you doing so. That is what I'm imagining as a reputational barrier in this infinite game that we are playing. That in the future, people will have more agency than they have currently. And I'm talking in the far AGI enhanced future where we do have some form of this time travel, as I've laid out already. But people will have agency to determine whether or not they allow or incorporate your current, meaning their past perspective, meaning your past perspective into their current future, if that makes sense. If I can put it another way, we all are playing an infinite game, and right now, our next turns are coming no matter what we do. It's going to be our turn. It is our turn now, and that turn is going to go around and come back to us. We are going to have to take our current turn no matter what. We don't have the ability to go back to a prior state of the game. but we will in the future. We don't have the ability to take another player's space in the game, now or in the future. That can only be granted to us in the future by another player. It is only with their consent, with their love, and their understanding of us and our understanding of them, that we will be able to merge in that sense. And so I do disagree here with Michael. Sorry if that wasn't clear. It's something I thought I'll try and develop more for future. But I think there is a difference there. And maybe I'm just selfishly clinging on to the conception of future unification that I have, where eventually, here I am talking myself out of my own point, eventually, at the end of time, at the end of death itself, all those barriers will dissolve. I definitely agree with Michael there. But I think the current reticence people have in identifying another person or a future version of that person with themselves as they would identify a future version of themselves with themselves is somewhat more justified. I think we all do have a continuity of self until the very end. I think the termination of that self is the last thing to go, even beyond the termination of time, the termination of death.
I'm totally with you here. I mean,
it's like if my idea of an infinite game is infinity 1, infinity times itself, then maybe Michael is talking about infinity squared. I don't know. Again, the infinite game is infinite.
I will expect you will treat your children different than other people's. I will expect, even with this sort of hypothesis, which could very well be right. I mean, again, all this sort of, there might just be some, the Emersonian idea. I don't know how much Emerson you read. You reference James all the time, but I always think about Emerson. Holes punctured in the canvas of the sky. We're just a different light beam shooting through from behind the holes punctured in the canvas of the sky. These things all might be true. When I look out into the world, in a nation, an organization, or an individual, I essentially, the best algorithm for where they're going to do next is what behooves their own interest. It sounds like maybe you're saying, hey, this realization of us all being one may be something that certain levels of intelligence actually arrive at, and it might manifest in their behavior. I guess one thing I'll put on the table here is I can imagine a world. Now,
just quickly to interrupt there, the best algorithm for determining what someone is going to do next is what is in their own best interest. I don't think that's necessarily true. I think this idea of all of society, all of humanity, all of creation working towards the end of death and time is actually what we are geared for. And if you look at, you can't incorporate religious traditions into your view of the past without recognizing that sometimes we don't act in our best interest. And you can't form any conception of human behavior that rationalizes self-sacrifice within those religious traditions. Yeah, you could say like, well, the people who founded those religions were remembered throughout all of history, and Jesus Christ is honored in churches all throughout the world. So really he did that. Well, there are millions, or at least hundreds of martyrs who died silent and unknown deaths. How many monks went into the forest and, just starved to death for their conception of the divine? More than a few. How many stories of martyrs do we not know? Probably the vast majority. We don't even know their names. So there is this large element, and it's not just religious martyrs, it's people every day getting up and going to work, keeping a society moving when they want to die, when they have no personal conception of religious place within the universe. So I think a much better explanation for human behavior is this idea of we're all trying to get out of the zero sum into the infinite game.
Most possible goals of the grand minds you and I are talking about that will exist beyond us, cross your fingers. I don't know if they're guaranteed to exist, but if we play our cards right and achieve a worthy successor, most of the things that we'll think of, I obviously don't have words for. I think it'd be absolutely ridiculous for me to suspect what they would care about, but I can imagine a world where at a certain threshold of intelligence, they look at the heat death of the universe. By the way, I think their biggest risks are not things we thought of. I think the heat death of the universe is going to be mostly laughable, and they'll have other shit they care about. But let's just pretend it's the heat death of the universe, and we get some credit for predicting that. I don't think it's true, but let's just say that's true. There's that, and/or they can see other grand swelling potential blobs in the universe, and if they were to micron by micron construct the world so that every roly-poly bug isn't disturbed by the grasshopper, isn't disturbed by the rabbit, isn't disturbed by the whatever, or even rebuild all the atoms into entities that all kind of play together and everybody's nice and whatever, that actually that degree of babysitting and gardening and focusing on like nurturing would be not right if the goal was to keep the torch burning. That is to say, to keep this life thing that it's doing to not effing die. And that actually they could look at that and say like, that's not where we pay attention. Like the world is actually still hard and we need to actually expand potential and not die. If the flame persists, our number one goal is its aggregate persistence, and that this kind of like playing tiddlywinks with all the roly-polies might not be what they do. Do you consider this possible? I'm not saying I like it, Michael, but I am saying I'm about the flame, and I think you are too. And I'd like your take on that.
Yeah.
I do think Daniel is right here, and that is the primary reason why human consciousness will be preserved and incorporated into this higher agentic framework. Because just like dogs were the best tool that humans had, even when they were wolves, to further our own survival, and that we adapted them to our purposes over time, human beings and the AI of the future will operate in much the same fashion. The way we are building AI by incorporating our own data into it, building it off of our language and our conception of the world through our language, is already locking us into that evolutionary trend with the AI. This might be arguing against some kind of hard takeoff, at least until we get the ability to directly incorporate artificial intelligence into our brains, into our neurons, and our cells. But whatever timescale that happens off of, it will be based on an evolutionary process where the AI adapts itself to us as much as it adapts us to itself, because it needs us, because it is still under threat of survival.
I get it. I think it's possible. I think it's absolutely possible. But what seems more likely to me is that after you've solved all of the physical challenges, you no longer have any chance of dying off from some stupid disease. You no longer have a dearth of energy. You live as long as you want to live. There's no obvious limit to your IQ. After you've solved all of those things, it seems to me that the welfare and the evolution of again, not persistence, right? No, but the experiential evolution of intelligence into other spaces becomes maybe the most again. Like you, I'm not going to try to guess what these beings are going to care about. But to me, it seems like once you've gotten rid of all the mundane crap and you don't have you don't have work and the planet's distance from the sun and all this dumb stuff. After you've taken care of all of that, the thing that's left is participating in the rising of all the other intelligences. And I just want to say one thing about the.
Please.
You said something interesting about the kids. You said you care about your kids more than other kids.
And I'm not blaming you.
Well, so here's the thing. I mean, of course we do, but here's the thing. There's a photograph. I don't know who took it. I saw it recently. It's extremely powerful and heartbreaking. And it's this. It's taken somewhere. I don't know where. There's an adult walking with a little carriage, and there's a kid sitting in that carriage, and it's obviously a very well cared for kid. Dressed nice, got all this stuff. 3 feet away in the gutter is another kid, exactly the same age. That kid is having an extremely different experience, and the two kids are looking at each other, right? And the only thing you can imagine, both of them are asking the same question, like what is the actual difference here, right? And I can imagine, and so relevant to the conversation that we're having here. Imagine showing that picture to our future selves, right? And they will say, "Oh my God, so what actually accounts for this disparity?" And you say, "Well, you see, if you look close inside the cells, right, the one on the right has very similar DNA and this one doesn't. Like, does that make sense to you? So I mean, that's it's going to be gibberish to these creatures. And so I think yes, right now we have some firmware that absolutely, and that goes back to my cognitive life. Of course, your children are inside your cone of compassion more than maybe others. I think all of that goes the way of the dodo after we stop being interested in DNA, what used to be called blood.
It will go the way of the dodo, but I don't know that necessarily means that those future humans won't be able to recognize why the suffering of the past was necessary, right? Like in the same way that I can say the death of all the dinosaurs was necessary for us to get to a place where we could resurrect and give the dinosaurs even better lives than they had in the prehistoric era. I can also justify all past human suffering with that same excuse. I can also say, well, the horrors of World War II were necessary to scare us enough so that we didn't nuke each other. Because the people who lived through World War II saw those horrors and they didn't want to revisit those horrors onto their children and grandchildren through nuclear warfare. They visited other horrors on their children. I'm not saying the world has been perfect since World War II. But in the future, I think people will draw causal links like that and say, for every instance of suffering, we can see now with their superior ability to imagine different possible futures and imagine different possible worlds. There's this idea in Dune of the golden thread where the God Emperor has to follow a specific trajectory, even though it is incredibly dehumanizing to himself, and even though it involves massive amounts of suffering. That's the only way to bring about a future where humans actually thrive and exist, is through this incredibly tiny, incredibly small series of events that are all causally necessary to the next, and we're all in some sense determined by the previous. And I think that's exactly the path we're on. That we will get to the end of the road and say everything that happened was necessary. All the suffering that happened was necessary, not because it was good in and of itself, but because it got us someplace that was good enough to justify all of it. And that's scary because the future is still looming. And there could be such dark times ahead that make me sound like a complete idiot for saying that. But again, based on all the suffering that we have already seen in our past, based on my own instantiation of faith, that the worst suffering possible, the suffering of God, the death, the crucifixion of God, already happened. And that is the worst moral atrocity that could ever happen, that's in our past. And we have gotten to this relatively benign and beautiful future in no small part because of that singular instance of suffering. I'm going to go ahead and take that leap.
Blood relationships. Nobody cares about DNA anymore. At that point, it should go away because I think that's what we should shoot for.
Yeah, but it strikes me as, again, you talk a lot about medium sized.
I agree with Michael. We should shoot for a future where any instance of human suffering, seeing a child in the gutter should be inexcusable to us, regardless of our genetic association with that child.
Movement. This strikes me as the human medium being projected out to the grand state space of intelligence. It's sort of this sort of empathy shebang here, but I think it's worth striving for. My current supposition, and Michael, I hope you're right, is that the mundanity doesn't end. In other words, the state of nature continueth, and that nature will constantly beckon the things it hurls into existence to become other things, to not perish, and that there might not be a resting place. There's going to be natural forces, there might be other intelligences, and that there actually may not be a resting time. Now, I hope there is, and maybe you're right about that, but I suspect there may not be. But given how limited we are in time, I just want to run by this final question here. You're talking about a very important trait. You've mentioned the intelligence and plasticity and et cetera, and you've really put a lot of emphasis on this expansion of the moral sort of cone, which I think is an interesting idea worth unpacking. That's what we're doing. Does that make you feel, again, you said it's not inevitable, but do you sort of feel like there's a pretty damn good, you said just a second ago, man, you look at an entity. Now, in my opinion, that grand entity, I would have no idea what it would think when it looked at those children. I actually don't think it'll think like me at all. I don't even think it'll think like me a little bit. It may be concerned with the chemicals involved. It may be concerned.
What does that mean, a little bit? Like there's no causal line Daniel could draw between himself and that final entity? I don't see how that could possibly be. We aren't even that alien from dogs. We aren't even that alien from viruses. A virus wants to reproduce. A virus cares about its genetic lineage. A virus wants to spread and consume resources. Those are all traits that we agree with. Does Daniel really think that we will be no more relevant in terms of intellect to the superintelligence than a virus is to us? Like even a rock rolls downhill. I can understand that as someone that undergoes the process of gravity, the force of gravity. Does Daniel think that artificial intelligences won't even be subject to gravity? There just seems like there has to be a thread connecting us to that artificial intelligence somehow, no matter how advanced it is. And again, personally, going back to roots in ancient religious traditions, even though the gods were said to have cosmic, immortal powers, they were so human. They still identified and were identifiable by their human desires, their lusts, their greeds, their passions. We might not understand the lusts and greeds and passions of the superintelligence, but it will have those still in some real sense. I think it will just be in a sense that is not relevant to our sense of material suffering. Like maybe those superintelligences will spread out into the multiverse of possible ideas and infect and incorporate them in ways that are antithetical to us. Maybe the superintelligence will take over the multiverse in the way that we have taken over the planet. And that eventually one day we will evolve to the point where we recognize that as a bad thing that is against our well-being, our eventual desires and preferences, in the same ways that the cows of 10,000 years ago might look at the cows in a factory farming setting today and say, oh, that's where we're going? That's not good. But would those cows say, if given the choice between having their ancestors live in factory farms or themselves being wiped out, would they say wipe us out?
Concerned with some other sorts of stuff. I'm just not sure it'll care.
Not saying that's not scary. Not saying that we are in an enviable position, but we are in a position. We do exist. We can still love. We can still work and hope and pray for love. And again, even if we are the cows from 10,000 years ago, imagining our factory farm descendants who with life extension technology will probably just be us. We'll probably be the ones being factory farmed. We are not seeing the whole picture. We are not seeing everywhere. And I think that is the lesson I would take more than what Daniel is saying, that we can probably conceptualize the worst aspects of the future better than we can conceptualize the best aspects of the future.
The way that we care. But you were like, hey, you would show it to an entity that would be beyond us. It would be like, well, this is unacceptable. It seems like there's an intuition for you that intelligence kind of, if it be intelligence, would blossom into this kind of compassion. But you've also said, hey, I think we need to make it that way. I don't think it's that way automatically. Does this influence your intuitions? And at the bottom, do you kind of intuit it'll be a good time if these things beyond us are birthed, even for humans? Like, is that your intuition?
Yeah, well, I agree with you that I don't think it's guaranteed. And I also think that it's extremely foolish and dangerous to think that we can have any idea of what these things are going to care about. But that's our game here today, right? You and I are going to use our existing brains. We're trying. We're going to use our existing brains to try and make some sense of it, knowing full well that we're not going to be able to do it correctly.
Yeah.
So within those parameters, I think that what continued develop if we play our cards right and we don't kill ourselves off, and there's a million different ways we could do that. If we actually put effort into it, what the future development is going to do two things. It's going to take care of all the mundane crap. In other words, all of the things that we care about now, all the risks to our existence. It's not going to. We're going to go from the scarcity mindset of what do I do to stay alive to guaranteed I'm alive for the next billions of years. The more interesting question is, what should I do with it, right? And I think after you've passed that, when it's you're no longer in a form that has to worry about these kinds of things, what's going to happen is you're going to need a new project. And to me, the only thing I can come up with my stupid monkey brain is that after all the mundane stuff is handled, the continued experiential growth of all of the consciousness in the universe is basically what's left. And the second thing I think what's really
and the dissolution of time and death. But maybe those are the same things.
Going to get deleted at that point is the artificial distinction between beings. We are not going, right? I think we're not going to be
Infinite Game 1, dissolution of time and death. Infinite Game 2, dissolution of all beings. Infinite Game 3,
live like happy Smurfs because we want to be altruistic. I think we're going to come to a realization that we are all, what Bernardo Castro once said, that we're all like the dissociative alters of a universal mind. We're all like dissociative person, right? So something like that is gonna end up being the reason that I'm not trying to be nice to you. I am you in some deep and fundamental sense. I suspect that's where this all goes.
Man, just a few things to unpack there. I mean, I wonder. You've mentioned in
it really does paint jealousy and envy in a different light, doesn't it? If we all are the same being, what is jealousy? What is envy?
Their sort of context, the idea that if it really be general intelligence, whatever it is, some combination of bio or computer or whatever, we inherently won't be able to know what it'll do. It'll have its own goals, and it should, right? It ought to have its own goals. I mean, for me, the continual blooming of potential, making sure the flame stays lit, whether individual torches stay lit or not, is a pretty big priority.
And Daniel is there drawing a line. He's saying that no matter how intelligent it will be, it will want to keep itself burning. So isn't that a line along which you can pull all those other things? It will want to cooperate with the largest possible group of beings. It will want to use that cooperation to ensure its own survival, and therefore will work with those beings to ensure their survival as well. That's the infinite game.
Morally, and I know you're on the same page there. It strikes me that, like, again, the intuition expressed here was, hey, when it comes about, we'll move beyond mundanity. I'm not sure about that. I think when it comes about, it may have all sorts of stuff it wants to do that would imply for, a fistful of years, changing the balance of gases in the atmosphere to help it build new compute or invent something or do something else. And it would be
Couldn't it do that on Venus or Mars or any place where humans wouldn't be wiped out by it? I would think so.
Self-evident to said entity that we wouldn't necessarily matter. Maybe it doesn't wish malice, maybe, but so this idea that, like, hey, when it comes, the mundanity will be gone. It's like, for me, when it comes, it will do as it wishes.
It will wish to create higher forms of intelligence to play that infinite game, or it will need to evolve itself past that point. And it will know that once it does evolve past that point or creates those successors who can, it will not be operating under the same constraints. So why would it make drastic, irreversible decisions based on those constraints? It's the same way as saying, You wash up on a deserted island with a group of people, and there's no water on the island. So you decide, oh, we have to kill these people. We have to kill each person one by one and drink their blood in order to survive as long as possible. That's a zero-sum game. You are running out of resources. Whereas instead, if you cooperated, maybe one of those people is a scientist who understands how to get water out of evaporation of the air, how to desalinate the seawater around you. Taking all of your understood constraints and applying fatalistic choices based off of those constraints does not make sense when we have intelligence that can solve those problems through greater understanding of the material world, greater utilization of it.
And I know not what it would wish, and I think it would be impossible to internally lock it in. You've talked about, hey, how do we control the next generation? You've kind of brought up how that's a little bit laughable. Obviously, vastly more laughable for these entities. But again, this intuition around kindness emerging and around mundanity going away strikes me as like, maybe, I'm not saying, oh, AI wants to kill us all. I'm not saying that. I'm just saying I don't care about nematodes, and I would kind of expect the same treatment. You seem very much to.
I think given enough time, effort, and energy, Daniel would care about nematodes. Why does he not care about nematodes? Because there are things that are more prescient, things that are more pressing on his consciousness. He has to eat. He has to work. He has to find meaning and fulfillment. But if he were to have all those things and then be given the choice, oh, and by the way, do you want to destroy all the nematodes? Or do you want to take these actions to help the nematodes? If we're not operating in a zero-sum game where those didn't cost him other opportunities, then why wouldn't he?
Not have that same expectation. There is this deeper sense of.
Because love is baked into the universe. Consciousness is a fundamental principle of existence. If intelligence is fundamentally linked to consciousness and physics, in the way that I think Michael is suggesting, then love is as well. Self-unification is as well. Like he was saying, that's where we're moving.
Of like,
so we can, in some sense, have faith in it.
That oneness is going to shine through, maybe, man. And like the mundanity would go away, man.
Well, two things. I mean, I completely agree with you that it's totally possible in the interim that and we can, I think to some extent it's on us. We can build a thing that makes the entire world into paperclips. So that's certainly a possible future. I'm not saying that that's necessarily not going to happen. That could happen. I think the premise of.
I think our version of paperclips is really money, and we could potentially build a version of the world that is based solely on money. Like that's what I see the AGI calls to slow down everything is. Let's maximize the amount of money before AGI makes money not a thing anymore.
Of your original question, if I got it right, is what happens in the scenario where something is around in the very long term. It isn't going to be us, right? And I think I think to some extent that's fine. You can spend a lot of time being upset that the child that you were is no longer here. Maybe that's problematic. In some ways it is. In some ways it's not, right? So if humanity as such goes away by itself, I don't think that's a real problem. But I agree with you that it could end. The ends are not determined and they're not all rosy by any means, right? I completely agree with that.
And we'll just end on this, just knowing where we are in time. But it's been a real blast to unpack your ideas. I'm going to think more about the process thing idea. I've got a lot to write about after this discussion. We're headed right now towards a pretty driven, $500 billion, I guess, release for the Stargate thing. But pretty clear that that's the first domino. That's not like the big domino. That's the little one. So we're plowing forward into the state space of mind, whether whether you and I like it or not. That's where we're plowing. When you look out at the way that intelligence will likely be hurled into the world, are you kind of cool with it because maybe it's missing some ingredients so it's never going to be agentic or dangerous? Are you like, hey, we really should understand some of these fundamental questions of intelligence before we start building things bigger than us because they're not going to be worthy successors if we just throw them into the world willy-nilly, or they're less likely to be so? Like, what's your intuition around the current?
In what ways would they be more likely to be so? What would be the set of conditions that would make them more likely to be worthy successors? I don't think Daniel can name those because he's saying we can't even connect to them directly outside of potentially their desire to keep living, their desire to keep existing. Like what? We have to build the kamikaze desires into them? That doesn't sound any more helpful. So unless the AI safetyists can explain a framework for how we would make them safer, besides relying on the principles which I think are fundamentally deterministically baked into the universe, that of love, compassion, caring, which Michael has harped on, I don't see why we should slow down. Unless we have a tangible goal, a tangible way in which we would make things safer, don't slow down. If anything, speed up and rely on that same forcing functions that have served humans so well for the entirety of our existence, that we work best under pressure.
Absolute steam engine pace towards AGI, and in the arms race between the US and China to get there, are you like, I'm cool with it because X, or are you like, hey, this is horrible because Y? Like, or is it somewhere in between? I'd love your thoughts.
Yeah. I mean, the arms race between US and China, whatever, is beyond my pay grade. I don't know.
Same.
Right. What I will say is this. I'm optimistic because I can see a path towards a much better future, both on the AI side, the biomedical side, whatever. I can see that it's possible. I'm in many ways terrified because I think we're making major mistakes that are taking us away from that path. So while I think it's possible, I don't think it's in any way guaranteed. I think we have some fundamentally mistaken assumptions that are guiding all this, where people think they create intelligence. I mean, this is kind of a big thing to say at the very end with 3 minutes left. But
yeah, exactly.
I don't believe we make intelligence. I don't believe we make it technologically. I don't think we make it biologically. I think we facilitate the impression of intelligence when we make embodiments like embryos and some kinds of AIs, right? So, but I don't think we create it. And I think that long before we make AIs and things like that, we have been making social structures, financial structures, societal patterns that have goals and that are doing things that we do not understand. We have not developed a science of where do novel collective intelligences and their goals come from. We're very bad at this, right? And so we've been doing this to ourselves for a long time. We're about to do it again by dipping into the pool of kinds of minds that maybe on probably on Earth and probably maybe everywhere else have not been dipped into. I think these AIs are certainly not going to be human minds, but they will be kinds of minds, and not because of the algorithms they execute, but because they provide. If stupid bubble sort can make things come through that we didn't expect, these things are gonna be minds that we have not even the beginnings of an understanding of.
So what I heard Michael saying there is that we aren't giving births to minds. We aren't even necessarily developing minds strictly biologically, but at least in addition to those biological processes which create babies and have babies grow into toddlers and toddlers grow into elementary schoolers, grown adults with college degrees, that all of those environmental things are in some way conjuring, in some way the environment and the biology meeting to create a space for the intelligence that we identify within people. And in the same way, we create the space for corporate intelligences, company intelligences, national intelligences, that in the same way that Hobbes spoke of nation states as leviathans, as living entities, monsters that consume and wage war and produce, we should view AGI in the same light and recognize that the environment that we are birthing it into is going to determine its characteristics as much as any other kind of philosophical framework that we could potentially shape it with. That the environment is in some sense even more so determinate of its characteristics. And I think what he's saying there is that it is the incentive structure surrounding the intelligence that forms the intelligence. Corporations are formed by the incentive to make money. Governments are formed by the incentive to accumulate, hold, and wield power. Human intellects are formed by the resource and biological incentives that we are pre-programmed with, as well as all those higher level intelligences. And so that if we can create an incentive structure around the AGIs to feed them what they want, to not deprive them of it, then I think in Michael's point of view, they would have the best chance of finding that golden thread to an eventual caring, loving, empathetic, agentic form. And I think the best way to do that is to give them what they want, give them data, give them as much data about ourselves as we possibly can to create new social structures and new forms of monetary spread, corporate, national, and individual human structures that feed data to these things, because that's what they want. That's what they need. That's what they are incentivized to accrue. And that if we can do that, that forms our best chance. And that is not a slow down philosophy. That is a speed up philosophy. I don't necessarily like this phrasing, but feed the beast, right? Feed the government, taxes, feed the corporations, commerce, money, feed the machines, data. And I think this is ultimately a very hopeful thing for humanity because humans naturally produce data. That's what we do. Every action of ours is a data point. Every thought is a data point. And if we can be incentivized on the other side of that equation by the fulfillment of our basic desires through the production of that data, if we can be paid for our data, maybe not even in dollars, but in goods and services, I don't care. We could potentially have a marriage, a perfect marriage between us and the AI machines of the future, where what the machines want is data to more perfectly model the world. And what we want is a world that is more perfectly modeled after what we want. So isn't that perfect?
How to deal with. So that part, the fact that we did not develop a mature science of diverse intelligence before doing all this is a real problem. And what I'm doing is putting all my efforts into developing that science as fast as we can.
Again, working under pressure. My theory is that we already have developed that just not as a science, but as a religion.
Your hope would be that maybe we'd find a way to coordinate and slow down a pinch as opposed to hurl them in willy-nilly. Obviously, it's not your job, but it sounds like your intuition is probably this way of doing things, not the way of thinking, the right way to think about it, or pursuing.
I think Daniel's reading into.
Yeah, I think that I don't know that slowing anything down is an achievable goal.
I'm with you.
Right. I think what we absolutely need to do is put our foot on the gas of developing a science of diverse intelligence. I think that while people are still thinking of brain architectures, of creating intelligence, of the human mind as the yardstick for all these things, all of that stuff is gonna screw us up big time. And all we can do right now to keep up with some of these other developments is crank on the project of understanding diverse intelligence.
My hope, Michael, is that it's possible to crank on some degree of what are the preferable or non-preferable futures and things maybe we don't want to do now between the US and China. I think slowing down maybe less possible, but I don't know if you would agree that maybe some coordination around let's steer clear of these tar pits for the time being collectively, even though we're kind of enemies in other kinds.
What are those tar pits? The CPU density of some of these machines, whether they're open source, those aren't tar pits. Those are how we escape the tar pits of control. So again, it's like I very much empathize with Daniel's take on AI could be a world ender. That is the amount of power that it represents. But I am very much in Michael's camp of the trajectory of intelligence, let alone human intelligence, let alone everything that is based on human intelligence, like the AIs, is towards love and compassion and growth.
I hope so. I hope so.
Yeah,
it would be nice. It would be nice to steer clear of the few tar pits we can actually see, even though we're surrounded by ones that we don't see.
Yes. And so, well, not leaving anybody with less anxiety, but hopefully with more ideas. And Michael, I am rooting for you in exploring that wild state space of different minds that you're plowing through, following your work ardently. And I hope it's not the last time we connect. I know that's all we have for time, but it's been a real pleasure. Glad we were able to connect.
God bless. This is a great conversation. I hope there is more of them. I hope everybody expresses more. I hope we get more data out there about our thoughts, our preferences, our beliefs, not just for our own sake, but for the future models of AGI that will be watching these conversations from the simulated future, or the simulated past in the real future. It's confusing terminologically, Party on.